They called him dead last. Then the Modulo Yuji soul rebooted and turned Naruto into a walking war crime. RCT healing while folding legends, dismantled turning Sanin into sushi, Black Flash making Jonin piss themselves, Pain folded, Madara soul stumped, Kaguya sealed like a cheap whore. Naruto ain't saving the village, he's reminding every god why they should stay dead.
The ruins had been there longer than the village, longer than the roads that fed into Konoha from the eastern forests, longer than the names men gave those forests, longer than the maps they drew to mark where civilization ended and wildness began. The ruins were a fact of the landscape, the same way bedrock is a fact. Too old to question, too settled to fence off with wire or warning signs, too forgotten to appear in any active record, Naruto Uzumaki found them when he was 5. He returned to them the way rivers move toward the sea. Without decision, without fanfare, following a pull he never needed to name. The village was full of eyes. Eyes that tracked him like a wound they refused to let heal, like a reminder of something they would have rather buried beneath the earth and paved over. He had learned by the age of 4 that the space between those eyes and his skin was the smallest distance he would ever have to cross, and the most dangerous. The ruins were empty. The silence there belonged to him, and he held it the way children hold things they know they will eventually lose, with both hands and without looking down. He was 7 years old the night the floor gave way. It happened without prelude. One step on stone that had held his weight 100 times before, and then the stone stopped holding. The crack ran through the slab like a living thing, splitting the surface in 2 clean halves, and the earth beneath swallowed him whole. He fell through a gap in the world that had been waiting for the right weight to press against it, and he dropped into blackness so total it had texture. He hit the cavern floor with the sound a body makes when it meets stone from 30 feet up, a sound that belongs in morgues and accident reports, the kind of sound that precedes absolute stillness. The air down here was ancient. It smelled of wet mineral and something else, something animal and rank, something alive and hungry and aware that a small body had just entered its territory. The thing in the cavern had been waiting for a very long time. It was a bear, or it had started as a bear once in whatever era had produced it. The centuries underground had remade it into something else, a chimera assembled by isolation and malice and time's indifference, with a jaw that unhinged wider than any natural skull should permit, and claws that caught the faint light from the crack above and threw it back as something sharper. Its eyes were reflective and flat. The intelligence behind them was the intelligence of a creature that had learned, through decades of starvation and rage, to interpret every moving thing as food. It hit Naruto before he finished standing. The claws entered through his chest. They tore through his jacket, through the skin beneath, through the muscle wall, through the ribs that tried to do their job and failed entirely, and into the organs behind them. The boy's body left the ground and struck the far wall, and the blood that followed him painted a line across the stone floor that steamed in the cold air. His chest was open. His lungs were visible. His heart was exposed and stuttering in a cavity that was never supposed to see air, and the pain was everywhere, absolute. The kind of agony that rewrites a child's understanding of what the body is capable of experiencing. He bled out on the stone, and then something woke up. It came from below the pain, below the fear, below the 7 years of loneliness and the eyes and the empty apartment and the ruins and the boy's whole small life. It came from a place so old and so buried that language had never reached it, a place where a different lifetime's weight had been resting, coiled in the gap between the soul's foundation and the body that housed it. It rose through him the way a tide rises, without effort, without hurry, with the certainty of something that has done this before and will do it again. The wound stopped bleeding. White steam erupted from his torn chest in a violent plume that filled the cavern with heat and the smell of something burning clean. tissue knitted back together with the speed of something that had been healing fatal damage for longer than this village had existed. Ribs reformed, muscle fiber reattached in layers, the skin sealed over the new flesh in a wash of heat so intense it dried the blood on the ground beneath him. Reverse curse technique, activating from instinct, running on the memory of a body that had died and refused death more times than any record could hold. Naruto stood up. He looked at his hands. Small hands, a child's hands. The knuckles were raw where they had scraped the stone. The fingers were short and thin and lacked the calluses he remembered having. And he remembered. He remembered all of it. Centuries of it. Lifetimes of it. The weight of 1,000 battles and 1,000 funerals. And the faces of people he had loved so fiercely that their absence was still a physical sensation even now, even here, even in a body that had never met them. Gojo, Megumi, Nobara, Todo, Choso, names too old for this world, too heavy for this small chest, piling on top of each other in a cascade of grief and warmth and loss that covered the span of ages. His expression registered nothing that resembled shock. What crossed his face was recognition. The weary, unblinking recognition of a man discovering that his alarm has gone off again. I thought my shift was over. His voice was small, 7 years old, but the cadence belonged to something much older, something that had been speaking for so long that words had become a formality maintained out of habit rather than necessity. Turns out I'm still a cog. The chimera charged. It moved through the cavern with the force of its full mass, claws scoring the stone beneath it, jaws open wide enough to take him from the shoulders up. It had survived down here for longer than the village above had drawn breath. It had killed everything that had ever fallen into its territory. It was the final answer to every question this underground had ever asked. Naruto raised 2 fingers. Dismantle. The word left his mouth and the air in the cavern changed. An invisible grid of slashing energy expanded outward from his hand in a single pulse, so fast that the beast was inside the grid before its next stride completed. Each slash adjusted its output to the density of the material it encountered, bone, muscle, cartilage, tendon, hide, and cut through every layer with the indifference of a thing that had been dividing targets far more resilient than this for centuries upon centuries. The chimera ceased to be a single object. 100 pieces of what had been the apex predator of this forgotten cavern settled to the stone floor in a cascade that took 3 full seconds to finish falling. The cuts were perfect, geometrically flawless. Each cube of flesh and bone was identical in dimension to every other cube, and the surfaces where the slashes had passed were so clean they looked polished. The blood did not spray. The technique had been so total, so instant, that the cardiovascular system had never received the signal that it had been separated into 100 segments. The sounds those pieces made as they hit the floor, wet, dense, final, did not belong in any world a child should inhabit. Naruto stepped over them without looking down. He walked to the wall of the cavern, found a handhold, and climbed. His body was small and his arms were thin, but the cursed energy running through his muscles provided reinforcement that turned a 7-year-old's frame into something closer to an engine wrapped in skin. He pulled himself up through the crack in the floor. He stood in the ruins under a sky that had remained unchanged during the 30 minutes of his death and resurrection. The village was a collection of lights to the west. The wind smelled of pine and wood smoke. He walked back. His sandals were ruined. His jacket was destroyed, the chest of it torn open and stiffened with blood that had dried in the heat of the RCT. His face was clean. His eyes, if anyone had been close enough to look into them, had changed. The color was the same. The shape was the same. But behind them, in the space where a child's eyes hold the simple weight of a child's experience, there was now something else. Something dense and old and saturated with a weariness that 7 years could never have produced. Nobody saw him come back. He walked through the empty streets of Konoha at an hour when all good children were indoors, and the few adults who might have noticed chose, as they always chose, to look away. He entered his apartment. He stood in the middle of the single room where his entire life was stored. A bed, a table, a carton of expired milk in a refrigerator that buzzed too loud. And he accepted this new existence the same way he accepted everything. without ceremony, without self-pity, a cog that had resumed turning because turning was the only verb a cog had ever been given. The soul of Yuji Itadori, the Modulo, the version who had lived beyond all mortal limits, who had mastered every technique the age of sorcery had ever produced, who had outlived every person he had ever loved until loneliness itself became a kind of companion, had found a new body. He had never chosen any of this. A cog does not choose when it turns or why or for how long. It turns. That is the entire description. The years that followed were unremarkable from the outside and immeasurable from within. Naruto attended the academy because attendance was expected, and he met expectations the way a river meets the banks that contain it, without resistance, without enthusiasm, occupying the shape the world assigned him. His classmates practiced chakra control exercises. They molded energy through hand signs and celebrated when a leaf stuck to their forehead or a puddle of water held its shape for 6 seconds. Their instructors praised effort and corrected form, and spoke about the will of fire with the tone of people who had been taught since birth to speak about it that way. Naruto sat in the back row. His grades were middling. His participation was minimal. He answered questions when called upon with the brevity of someone who found the curriculum interesting, the way a carpenter finds a child's drawing of a house interesting, endearing in its fashion, but built on assumptions so foundational to the child's worldview that correcting them would require dismantling the child's entire understanding of structure. He trained alone, at night, in the forests outside the village walls, in clearings where the trees were thick enough to muffle sound, and the distance from the nearest patrol route guaranteed privacy. He trained his body to accept the cursed energy that ran through it. Energy so dense and so refined that the air around him warped when he pushed it above resting levels, a visible distortion that bent light the way heat bends light above asphalt. The shinobi world called everything that flowed through the body chakra. They had taxonomies for it, schools of thought, entire libraries devoted to its classification. What ran through Naruto was older than their taxonomies, older than their village, older than the concept of villages and the wars that made villages necessary and the fears that made wars inevitable. Cursed energy, the distilled essence of human suffering, refined across centuries of exposure into something that could reshape the laws of the physical world when channeled through a soul with enough experience to direct it. He let them call it chakra. The name did not matter. The function was the same. He made neither friends nor enemies. He occupied space in the classroom the way furniture occupies space. Present, accounted for, interacting with the room only when someone chose to engage it. His classmates sensed something about him that their 12-year-old vocabularies could not articulate. The loud ones avoided him by instinct. The perceptive ones, the Nara boy who watched everything from behind half-closed eyes, the Aburame boy whose insects became agitated whenever Naruto passed too close, gave him a wider berth and said nothing about why. Sasuke Uchiha sat 2 rows ahead and carried the weight of a massacre in his posture. Naruto recognized grief in the boy's spine before he ever heard the story. He recognized the angle of shoulders bearing something they had never agreed to bear and could never set down. He had seen that posture before. He had worn that posture before. For lifetimes, across eras, in bodies that no longer existed. He said nothing about it, because some things can only be spoken about by people who have finished carrying them, and neither of them had finished. Sakura Haruno was kind in the way that children who have never been truly hurt are kind. Generously, without conditions, with the assumption that the world would reward kindness because that was what the world was supposed to do. Naruto watched her the way he watched all innocent things, with a patience that came from knowing exactly how fragile innocence was and how fast the world moved to test it. The assignments were posted. Team 7, Naruto Uzumaki, Sasuke Uchiha, Sakura Haruno. Jonin instructor Kakashi Hatake. Kakashi arrived 3 hours late. He appeared on the railing of the academy rooftop with the Icha Icha novel already open and his single visible eye carrying the lazy affect of a man who had decided long ago that performing disengagement was easier than explaining why he was actually engaged. Naruto saw through the act in the time it took Kakashi's foot to settle on the railing. He saw the Anbu tattoo faded on the man's shoulder beneath the sleeve. He saw the grief for Obito sitting in Kakashi's slouch, the same way the massacre sat in Sasuke's spine. He saw the Sharingan behind the headband, dormant, borrowed, carrying its own weight of transplanted guilt. The bell test was scheduled for the following morning. Training ground 3, 2 bells, 3 students. Underneath the rules was the real test. Teamwork, coordination, the willingness to subordinate individual ambition to collective survival. Naruto understood the real test. He had understood tests like this for longer than Kakashi had been alive. He was going to ignore it. The morning arrived, the way mornings arrive in Konoha. Birdsong, mist burning off the training grounds, the smell of dew on cut grass. Sakura positioned herself behind a line of bushes to the east. Sasuke found a tree with strong branches and a clear sight line. Both of them did what they had been trained to do. Conceal, observe, wait for an opening. Naruto walked out of the tree line and stood in front of Kakashi. The distance between them was 15 feet. Kakashi's book was open. His eye tracked the page with the practiced indifference of a man who had used this same posture to disarm dozens of genemes before this one. He looked up after a beat designed to make the student feel unimportant. "A ninja must see underneath the underneath," Kakashi said. Naruto stood with his hands at his sides. His posture was loose in the way that very dangerous things are loose. Relaxed, because tension would be wasted effort, because the body already knew what it was going to do and was simply waiting for the signal to do it. His eyes met Kakashi's single visible eye, and what Kakashi saw in them made the page in front of him lose focus for a fraction of a second. Those were not a 12-year-old's eyes. They carried a weight that had nothing to do with the academy or the village or the test or the bells. "I've killed God, Sensei." The voice was even, uninflected, delivered with the cadence of someone stating the time of day. "You're just a man reading a book." Kakashi closed the book. He closed it with the reflex of a man whose survival instincts had been forged in Anbu Black Ops, in the Third Shinobi War, in a lifetime of encounters where the difference between reading a threat correctly and reading it wrong was measured in funerals. The novel slid into his hip pouch without his eye leaving Naruto's face. His stance shifted, feet widening, weight distributing, the laziness evaporating like steam off hot stone. Naruto moved first. He closed 15 feet in a single step. The motion was efficient in a way that Kakashi's Sharingan, if it had been uncovered, would have struggled to track, because the body mechanics behind it belonged to a system of movement that predated taijutsu by centuries. Naruto's fist arrived at Kakashi's guard, and the Jonin blocked it, reading the trajectory and intercepting it with the practiced ease of a man who had survived 10,000 exchanges exactly like this one. The impact traveled through Kakashi's forearm and registered as manageable. Fast for a genin. Stronger than expected, but manageable. Then Naruto threw a second strike, and a third, and a fourth. Each one arrived from an angle that should have been impossible given the previous strike's trajectory, as if the boy's body was operating on a different set of physical laws than the ones Kakashi had spent his life mastering. Kakashi blocked them all. His taijutsu was elite, the physical language of a shinobi who had earned every scar he carried and survived every loss that should have ended him. He read the angles, he intercepted the force, he maintained distance, and he found zero purchase. Every counter he launched, the reversals, the joint locks, the trips and sweeps, and the 1,000 small violences that Konoha's taijutsu system taught its best, met empty air, or a parry so economical in motion that it felt like striking water. Naruto moved around Kakashi's technique the way a river moves around a stone. He was inside the system and outside it simultaneously, occupying a space between the strikes where Kakashi's training had never taught him to look. Then Naruto bit his thumb. Blood manipulation, piercing blood. The blood compressed in his mouth, an amount so small it should have been insignificant, and fired from between his lips in a beam thinner than a pencil and faster than sound. The air split along the beam's path with a sound like cloth tearing. It crossed the distance between them. In a fraction of the time it would take Kakashi to blink, it hit the book. The Icha Icha novel was still in Kakashi's hip pouch, and the beam drilled through the pouch, through the front cover, through every page, through the back cover, through the pouch's rear panel, and embedded itself in the oak tree 20 feet behind Kakashi's position. The entry hole was the width of a coin. The exit hole was identical. The tree groaned around the impact point, and a single leaf detached from the branch above and drifted down in a silence that seemed to expand to fill the training ground. Kakashi's hand went to his hip by reflex. His fingers found the hole. His mind, which had cataloged over 1,000 jutsu through years of sharing and exposure, searched its entire index for a match and returned empty. Before the search could restart, Naruto was inside his guard. Kakashi sensed it, a wrongness in the air around the boy's right fist, a pressure that made the fine hairs on his arm stand straight, and his skin tightened the way skin tightens before a lightning strike. It was the feeling of standing too close to an event that was about to rewrite everything within arm's reach. The spatial distortion compressed into a point at Naruto's knuckles. The air twisted in a 6-inch radius around his hand. Black sparks, something that occupied a category Kakashi's experience had never needed to build, crawled across the surface of the fist like living things looking for somewhere to land. Black flash. The punch connected with the center of Kakashi's flak jacket. The impact was more than physical. The black lightning erupted from the point of contact. A crack of energy so dense it bent the light around it and traveled inward through the flak jacket, through the mesh armor beneath, through muscle and bone, and into something deeper. Something Kakashi had never been struck in before. Something that existed below the physical, below the chakra network, below every defense he had ever built across a lifetime of war and loss. His soul. Kakashi's knees hit the ground before his brain finished processing the input. His muscles stopped accepting signals. His hands that had performed 1,000 hand signs, that had channeled lightning through the Chidori so many times the calluses were permanent, lay flat on the grass and refused to close into fists. His visible eye was wide open, staring at nothing, because the thing it needed to look at was inside him, and what it saw there was damage in a place he had never known could be damaged. He had survived Obito's death. He had survived Ren's death. He had survived the Third War and its aftermath and the decade of grief that followed. He had fought S-rank criminals and missing nin and things that came out of the ground with teeth and malice. In all of that, across all of those encounters and years, he had never felt anything like this. It was the sensation of being struck by something that existed outside every framework he had ever been taught. His Sharingan could not copy it. His experience could not classify it. His body could not heal it because the injury was not to his body. The injury was to the foundation beneath his body, the spiritual architecture that held the rest of him upright. And that architecture was ringing like a bell hit by a hammer made for demolition. The training ground was silent. From behind the bushes to the east, Sakura Haruno's hands had stopped moving. They were frozen at her sides, fingers curled inward, her body locked in the posture of someone who has witnessed something her mind cannot yet file. Her eyes were wide and her mouth was open, and she had been holding her breath for 9 seconds and counting. She had watched Naruto walk up to their Jonin instructor, a man whose reputation she had researched, whose mission record she had read in the academy library, whose legend included surviving things that killed everyone else in the room, and put him on his knees with a single punch. The sound that punch had made was still rattling around inside her skull, searching for a category and finding every category it touched insufficient. From the tree to the north, Sasuke Uchiha's jaw was clenched in a line so tight it was visible from 50 feet away. His eyes, unaided, had tracked the movement well enough to see the beginning and the end, and what sat between the beginning and the end was a gap so absolute that staring into it felt like staring into a well whose bottom he would never reach. He had dedicated his life to becoming strong enough to kill one person. He had measured his progress against the benchmarks the Academy provided and found himself exceptional by every available metric. Naruto had just rendered every available metric irrelevant. The bells hung from Kakashi's belt. Naruto reached down and took them both. The metal was cool against his palm. He held them for a moment. A moment that looked from the outside like hesitation, but was actually the pause of a man who had won so many exchanges like this that winning had stopped carrying the weight it once did. He walked to where Sakura was still frozen behind the bushes. He placed one bell in her open hand. He walked to the tree where Sasuke was perched and tossed the second bell upward. It arced through the morning air, catching the sunlight at the apex, and landed in Sasuke's palm. Naruto said nothing about it. The bells were objects. The test was an exercise. The only thing that mattered was what happened next, and what happened next was always the same. The cog kept turning, and the people around it either kept up or fell behind. Kakashi found his feet 11 minutes later. His hands still trembled at the edges. A fine vibration he concealed the moment he noticed it, because admitting physical failure had never been part of his vocabulary. He looked at the three genin. Sakura clutching her bell like a talisman. Sasuke holding his with an expression that mixed bewilderment and something hotter and more dangerous. Naruto standing between them with neither bell nor concern, those ancient eyes already fixed on whatever came next. He passed Team 7. He reported to the Hokage that evening, and the document he filed contained a sentence he had never expected to write in any context. The Uzumaki boy operates on a level I am unable to assess. Recommend observation at the highest clearance. Hiruzen Sarutobi read that sentence twice. He set the report on his desk, removed his pipe from his mouth, and sat in a silence that stretched long enough for the shadows in his office to shift. The world had taken notice of Naruto Uzumaki. It did not yet understand what it had noticed. The mission to the Land of Waves arrived 3 weeks later, stamped with a C-rank classification that would prove to be one of the more breathtaking miscalculations in the Konoha Mission Office's recent history. Tazuna, the bridge builder, smelled like cheap sake and carried the nervous energy of a man who knew he was lying about the danger level, but had bet everything on the lie, holding long enough to get him home alive. Team 7 accepted the assignment because that was what genin teams did. They packed their gear and walked out the village gates and headed east toward the coast. Naruto walked at the rear of the formation. He carried nothing except the clothes on his body and the centuries inside his skull. He watched the road with eyes that had seen more roads than this continent held. He said nothing for the first 6 hours of travel. Sakura filled the silence with questions. Sasuke filled it with brooding. Kakashi filled it with turning pages. The mist arrived on the second day. It rolled in from the water like a curtain being drawn. Thick, white, absolute, swallowing the road and the trees and the horizon in a wall of vapor so dense that visibility dropped to the length of an arm. The temperature fell. The sounds changed. The birds stopped singing, because birds have the good sense to go silent when the air fills with something that smells like violence. Naruto's perception activated the moment the killing intent hit the atmosphere. He felt it the way a centuries-old sorcerer feels a cursed spirit. By the weight of it, the spiritual density of the malice riding inside the fog, the shape of the hatred pressing against his awareness like a hand against glass. He knew where the man was standing before the man decided to move. He knew his general shape, large, powerful, carrying a weapon that had its own spiritual signature, drenched in the residue of 100 kills. Zabuza Momochi stepped out of the mist like he had been assembled from it. The executioner's blade rode his back, a slab of metal so massive and so heavy that lifting it one-handed was itself a statement of everything its wielder claimed to be. His eyes above the bandages were flat and professional, the eyes of a man who had killed his entire graduating class as a child and stacked every subsequent year of his life on that foundation. The killing intent he radiated had texture, oily, heavy, pressing down on Sakura and Sasuke like a physical force, until Sakura's breathing went shallow and Sasuke's hand found his kunai holster and locked there. Kakashi reached for his headband. Naruto stepped forward. He moved past Kakashi the way you step past furniture. His movement was unhurried and total. The mist parted around him as he walked, pushed aside by the pressure of cursed energy radiating from his body. A pressure so dense that the water vapor within 2 feet of his skin evaporated on contact, leaving him surrounded by a halo of clear air in a world of white. Zabuza read the approach. He was a professional. Professionals read body language the way scholars read text, by the spacing, by the weight of each gesture, by what was absent as much as what was present. What he read in the boy walking toward him made zero sense within any framework he possessed. The body was 12 years old. The posture was 1200. He swung the executioner's blade. The sword came down in an arc that carried the weight of everything Zabuza was, his reputation, his exile, his survival, the foundation of terror he had built in the hidden mist and carried into every room he entered. The blade displaced air hard enough to push back Tazuna's hair from 20 feet away. It was a killing stroke, the one Zabuza had used to end fights against Jonin, against Hunter Nin, against men twice his size and half his mercy. Naruto caught it flat side with one hand. The impact stopped, completely, as if Zabuza had swung the full force of his arm and his rage and his legacy into the side of a mountain, and the mountain had declined to notice. The shock traveled up the blade and into Zabuza's arms and shoulders and registered as something his body had never transmitted before: futility. The blade was still. The boy's hand was wrapped around its flat surface, arm extended at full length, and the arm was not shaking. It held position with the ease of a thing that had held heavier instruments than this for longer than this man had been alive. Naruto looked up at him. The dull, ancient eyes met the flat, professional ones, and what Zabuza saw in them made his stomach drop in a way it had never dropped before. During the massacre, during his exile, during any of the years he had spent as a hunted man in a world designed to kill hunted men, nothing had produced this sensation. "You call yourself a demon?" Naruto said. His voice carried across the water without rising. "I've eaten real demons." He activated Cleave. The technique read its target in a fraction of a second. The executioner's blade's density, its composition, its legendary resilience, the generations of blood and conflict that had been folded into its steel, and matched its output to exceed everything it found. The adjustment was instant. The result was absolute. The blade did not chip. It did not crack. It did not fracture along a fault line or split along a seam. It reduced to metallic dust in Zabuza's hands. The legendary weapon, the sword that had survived wars, that had been passed down through the 7 swordsmen of the mist as the emblem of their lineage, ceased to exist as a solid object. The powder poured through Zabuza's fingers and caught the faint light in the mist and fell to the water's surface, where it spread in a thin gray film that smelled of iron and the end of an era. Zabuza looked at his hands. They were open. His fingers were curled around the shape of a grip that was no longer there. His palms were coated in gray powder that was still warm from the conversion. His entire identity, the demon of the hidden mist, the man who carried the executioner's blade, because the executioner's blade was what made the man, was standing in the fog, holding 2 fistfuls of everything he used to be. Fear found him. It found him in a place he had bricked over decades ago, in the hollow behind his ribs where human beings keep the emotions they have decided they are finished using. The bricks were gone. The hollow was open. And what flooded in was a sensation so unfamiliar that his body lacked the architecture to process it. The raw, uncut understanding that he was standing in front of something he could not fight, could not flee from, and could not negotiate with. His legs held, because the pride that had survived the massacre was still operational, but the signals his brain was sending to those legs included the word run for the first time since childhood. Naruto turned away from him. Zabuza stood in the mist, breathing, trying to reassemble a version of himself that made sense in a world that now contained whatever he had just encountered. He lowered his empty hands. He stepped back. He vanished into the fog the way he had arrived, with the instincts of a professional leaving a situation that had exceeded the boundaries of professionalism, and every step he took away from the boy felt like a step back toward a version of reality where the rules still applied. On the bridge, days later, Haku stood between Naruto and the mission's completion. The ice mirrors formed around them, a dome of reflective surfaces, each one containing Haku's image, each one a launching platform for Senbon, thrown at speeds that would overwhelm any genin's capacity to track. The technique was beautiful. Naruto recognized its beauty the way a man who has seen 1,000 sunsets recognizes a sunset, with appreciation that exists alongside the understanding that beauty and lethality are not mutually exclusive. Haku's senbon found their marks. They embedded in his arms, his shoulders, his neck. Each one was thrown with killing intent refined by love. Because Haku's violence was built entirely on devotion, on the willingness to become a weapon for the person he served. And the purity of that devotion made the technique as clean and lethal as anything Naruto had seen from sorcerers 3 times Haku's age. The senbon were ejected in bursts of white steam as the RCT pushed them from his flesh and sealed the wounds before Haku could follow up. The blood evaporated. The punctures vanished. Haku threw another volley, and each one hit, and each one healed, and each one left. Naruto standing in the center of the dome, undiminished, watching the boy in the mirrors with an expression that held something much closer to sorrow than aggression. "You fight for someone you love," Naruto said. A statement delivered without inflection. Haku's hands paused mid-throw. Behind the mask, his eyes widened. He had expected desperation. He had expected the survival instinct of a genin cornered by a superior technique. Instead, he received the observation of someone who understood the architecture of his devotion, because that someone had built similar architectures before and watched them crumble under the weight of centuries. "You remind me of someone," Naruto said. He did not say who. The name was too old for this world, too heavy for this moment. Speaking it here would have served nothing except the private grief of a man wearing a child's face. Your devotion is real. Hold on to it. There are worse things to be than a tool used by someone who matters to you. The mirrors fell. Haku dropped from them and landed on the bridge, kneeling. His mask cracked from a ricochet during the exchange. Behind the crack, one brown eye stared at Naruto with the bewildered recognition of someone who has been seen entirely by a stranger and has no framework for what to do with the experience. Then Gato arrived. He came from the far end of the bridge with an army at his back. Mercenaries, hired swords, the accumulated muscle of a man whose wealth had convinced him that every problem carried a price tag. Gato himself stood behind the first row of bodies, dressed in a suit that cost more than the bridge, wearing a smile that belonged to someone who had never once been told that money could not buy the outcome he wanted. "Kill them all," Gato said, with the bored authority of a man ordering lunch. "Start with the ninja." Naruto cracked his knuckles. The sound was small. It carried. "Where you go, I go," he said, to the air in front of him, to a memory only he could see, to the ghost of every person he had ever made that promise to across the ages. "If you come back as a curse, I'll kill you again." He walked into the crowd. The first punch triggered black flash. The spatial distortion compressed into the point of impact, and the black lightning erupted outward from the mercenary's chest in a ring of energy that warped the air for 10 feet in every direction. The man's body left the bridge surface and traveled 40 feet before hitting the water. He did not resurface. The men on either side of him were blown off their feet by the shockwave alone, weapons spinning from their hands, boots leaving the planks. The second punch, black flash. The third, black flash. Every strike carried the same impossible compression, the same crack of black lightning, the same concussive ring that rattled the bridge and splintered planks beneath the target's feet. He moved through the mercenary army the way a natural disaster moves through a settlement, without malice, without hesitation, with the simple momentum of something too large and too fundamental to be redirected by anything in its path. Men flew. They flew in directions that defied what their bodies should have been capable of traveling. They hit the water, they hit the railing, they hit each other. The ones still standing after 6 seconds found their legs pointing toward the far end of the bridge, and the ones smart enough to listen to their legs were already running. Gato watched his investment vanish. His smile left his face the way color leaves a photograph left in the sun, completely over seconds, until what remained was the blank comprehension of a man who has discovered that his money has purchased something other than the expected product. Naruto did not turn to look at him. Dismantle. The slashes adjusted to their target. Gato ceased to be a coherent object. The adjustment took less time than a blink, and the result was so complete that the bridge planks beneath where the man had stood bore zero evidence that a human body had occupied that space moments earlier. The mercenaries, still conscious, saw this happen. Those who could run did so. Those who could not lay on the planks and stared at the sky and waited for reality to reassert itself. The bridge fell silent. Tazuna stood at the foot of the structure he had spent his life building, hands at his sides, mouth open, tool belt hanging crooked because the buckle had come loose at some point during the previous 90 seconds, and he had been too occupied with what he was watching to notice. Behind him, the workers who had come that morning to lay stone and mix mortar stood in a cluster of slack faces and wide eyes. They had witnessed something that none of them would ever be able to describe to anyone who had been absent, because the vocabulary required to describe it did not exist in any language spoken on this coast. From the shore, the villagers of Wave had gathered. They lined the waterfront. Fishermen, merchants, mothers holding children, the old and the young, and the desperately poor. And they watched the smoke clear, and the boy standing at the bridge's center, alone, surrounded by the aftermath of something that had lasted less than 2 minutes and changed everything. Naruto walked to the edge and looked at the ocean. The water stretched to the horizon in every direction. He had seen more oceans than he could count. He had crossed more than this world contained. The salt air moved through his hair, and he breathed it in and let it out. And he felt, for a moment that lasted exactly as long as a moment should, the old familiar weight of being the one still standing when the standing was done. Zabuza watched from the tree line with Haku at his side. His arms were crossed. His hands were empty, permanently empty now. The weight of the sword, a phantom that would haunt his grip for the rest of his life. He looked at the boy on the bridge and said nothing, because the only thing he could have said was the truth. And the truth was that he had spent his entire career believing he was the most dangerous thing in any room he entered. And he had been wrong. And he would never be right again. Haku stood beside him and stared at Naruto with the expression of someone holding a question too large to ask out loud. The mission report Kakashi filed upon Team 7's return to Konoha contained words like unprecedented and unclassifiable, and generated a meeting between the Hokage and the village's senior advisors that ran 4 hours past its scheduled end. Naruto was invited to none of it. He would not have cared if he had been. The machinery of villages, their councils, their classifications, their anxious need to label everything that frightened them, was a thing he had observed in other forms, in other centuries, in other civilizations that no longer existed. Hiruzen added a second surveillance team to Naruto's file. The Anbu who drew the assignment reported, after their first week, that the boy spent his evenings sitting on the Hokage monument, staring at the village below, and that the expression on his face during those hours was one they lacked the clearance, or the vocabulary, to interpret. The Chunin exams opened 6 weeks later, and Konoha filled with foreign shinobi, dignitaries, and the tense energy of a village putting its youngest soldiers on display for profit and prestige. The first stage was written. The second stage was the Forest of Death, 44 training grounds worth of wilderness enclosed behind chain-link fencing, inhabited by creatures large enough to swallow a genin team and hostile enough to consider it. Each squad received a scroll and instructions. Acquire the opposite scroll, reach the tower at the center, survive. Team 7 entered from the eastern edge. The canopy overhead was so dense it filtered the light into something green and subaquatic, and the sounds of the forest, insects, birds, the distant crash of something massive moving through undergrowth, filled the air with the constant reminder that the environment itself was a participant. They made it 9 hours before the air changed. Naruto felt it first. His soul perception registered the intrusion the way a seismograph registers a quake, a sudden, massive displacement in the spiritual landscape, something entering the forest's atmosphere that carried a weight entirely out of proportion with anything else inside these fences. It was old. It was wrong. It was the spiritual signature of a soul that had been taken apart and reassembled so many times that the architecture barely resembled human construction anymore. The killing intent arrived a moment later. It hit Sasuke and Sakura like a wall. Sasuke's body locked. His muscles seized, his eyes went wide, and his breathing stopped. And every survival mechanism his body possessed fired at once and produced a single conflicting instruction: move and stay, fight and flee. The intent was so concentrated, so saturated with the residue of hundreds of kills, that standing inside it felt like standing inside a vision of your own death, complete, vivid, certain. Sakura fared worse. Her knees buckled, her vision tunneled. The kunai in her hand hit the branch beneath her feet, and she barely heard it land. Naruto stood between them. The killing intent washed over him and found nothing to grip. It was like pouring water over stone. The water moved, the stone did not. He had stood inside the killing intent of beings that would have made this man's aura feel like a match held next to the sun. He had bathed in the malice of entities that treated whole civilizations as food. This was a man, a powerful man, a dangerous man, but a man standing in a forest, wearing a disguise that Naruto's perception had already stripped away like wet paper. The disguise dropped. The face beneath was pale, angular, framed by hair that moved in a way hair should not move, as if the body wearing it had a different relationship with gravity than the bodies around it. The eyes were yellow and slitted. The tongue was obscene, extending from the mouth to a length that communicated something fundamental about the owner's relationship with the boundaries of the human form. Orochimaru of the Sannin, the serpent. The man who had been Hiruzen's student and Konoha's most celebrated prodigy before the experiments were discovered and the exile was mandated and the legend became the nightmare. Naruto looked at his soul. He saw it with total, unfiltered clarity, and what he saw made the revulsion rise in his chest like bile. The soul was grotesque, a patchwork assembly of stolen bodies, each one stitched to the next with jutsu and ego and the kind of spiritual adhesive that only a person willing to violate the most fundamental boundary of identity would use. Dozens of hosts layered on top of each other like geological strata, each one still carrying the faint echo of the person who had originally inhabited it. The original soul, Orochimaru's own, sat at the center of this construction like a spider in a web woven from the silk of other spiders, and it pulsed with an ambition so total that it had consumed everything around it and called the consumption progress. Naruto had seen this before, in other eras, in other worlds. He had seen sorcerers consume cursed spirits for power. He had seen humans devour other humans for the sake of strength. He had seen the end result of every iteration of this story. And the end result was always the same, a thing that started as a person and ended as something that could not remember what personhood meant. "You disgust me." His voice dropped. It fell several registers below what a 12-year-old's vocal cord should have been able to produce, into a range that vibrated in the chests of everyone within earshot. It sounded like something speaking from a much larger place than a boy's body. Something that had been listening from the far side of a wall and had decided to lean through. The syllables carried weight that pushed the air outward in a small, tangible pulse. Orochimaru's yellow eyes narrowed. He had expected a jinchuriki, a container. What he was hearing came from something that treated the container as an afterthought, and the voice belonged to a register that his instincts honed across decades of predation, flagged as a territory warning. He ignored the warning. He had ignored warnings before. He extended his neck toward Sasuke, the real target, the Sharingan bloodline, the vessel he intended to mark and cultivate and eventually wear. With the speed of a striking serpent, jaw unhinging, the curse mark already forming between his teeth. Naruto moved, 12 feet between him and that extending neck. He covered it in a time frame that existed below the threshold of human reaction. His right hand closed around Orochimaru's face. The whole face, the jaw and the cheekbones and the yellow eyes, and the momentum converted into a grip that stopped the Sannin's extension dead. Orochimaru's neck snapped taut. His body swung forward from the recoil. His hands came up to break the hold and found that the hold was operating on an output level his hands could not match. Naruto did not strike the body. He struck the soul. The soul strike connected at the boundary between Orochimaru's stolen physical form and the spiritual architecture beneath it. It was not a punch in any sense that combat systems recognized. It was an impact delivered to the foundation of Orochimaru's existence. The border where flesh met spirit, where the body's material structure gave way to the immaterial thing that animated it. The strike crossed that border and detonated on the other side. The pain that erupted was beyond anything the physical world could produce. It existed at a level below flesh and chakra, and ego and identity, at the bedrock of what a person was, at the layer Orochimaru had spent his entire life trying to reach through science and experimentation and body theft. He had wanted to touch that layer. He had dedicated decades to understanding it, manipulating it, exploiting it for his own ends. And he discovered now, with the sudden and total clarity of a man stepping off a cliff, that this layer could hurt him, that it could be reached by something other than his own instruments, that it could scream. Orochimaru screamed. The sound came from a place he had thought he'd abandoned. It was the scream of a man discovering that the inner sanctum he considered impregnable, the core, the essential self, the thing he had been building fortifications around since childhood, was being touched by a hand that treated those fortifications like wallpaper. The patchwork of stolen bodies trembled. The spiritual adhesive holding the layers together destabilized at the point of contact. And for a fraction of a second, the souls of the hosts he had consumed surfaced behind his yellow eyes, a flicker of other faces, other expressions, other people's terror, before Orochimaru's will reasserted itself and forced them back down. Naruto activated flowing red scale. The cursed energy surged through his body in a wave that amplified every physical parameter. Muscles hardening, tendons locking, grip strength multiplying beyond anything this Genin body should have been capable of containing. His hand on Orochimaru's face tightened until the bones beneath the skin groaned. He tore Orochimaru's arms from his body. The separation was visceral, ligaments parting, bone leaving socket, the wet sound of tissue exceeding its structural tolerance. Orochimaru's arms came away from his torso in Naruto's hands, and the stumps erupted in blood that hissed against the bark of the branch they were standing on. The Sanin's regeneration kicked in immediately, the stolen bodies providing raw material for reconstruction, but the soul damage underneath was not healing. It sat beneath the physical injuries like a fracture in a building's foundation, invisible from the outside, but undermining every structure built above it. Orochimaru fled. The legendary Sannin, the man who made Kaji uncomfortable, who had been offered the Hokage seat and declined it because the seat was too small for what he intended to become, who had spent decades operating at a level that placed him above the vast majority of living shinobi, fled from a child in a forest. His body reconstituted his arms as he moved, regeneration working at maximum capacity. But his soul was still ringing from the impact, and every survival instinct remaining in his spiritual architecture was broadcasting a single message. The thing in that clearing was a catastrophe wearing a boy's face, and the only appropriate response to a catastrophe was to put distance between yourself and its center before it decided to widen its radius. He left the forest. He left the exam. He did not plant the curse mark on Sasuke Uchiha's neck. Sasuke stood on the branch where the killing intent had frozen him. His body had unlocked in stages over the past 40 seconds. First his breathing, then his fingers, then his legs. And now he was standing under his own power, staring at the space where Orochimaru had been. His mind was running a process he could not interrupt. The comparison. The Sannin. A man who was, by any available measure, one of the most powerful beings in the shinobi world, had been seized by the face, struck by something invisible, dismembered, and driven to flee. By Naruto, the boy from the back row. The boy with the middling grades and the orange jacket, and those eyes that never seemed to be looking at the same century as everyone else. The gap between them. Sasuke had been measuring it since the bell test, remeasuring since the bridge, remeasuring since every moment he had watched Naruto operate and tried to find a ceiling. The gap had just expanded beyond any yardstick he knew how to use. The ruler was too short. The system of measurement he had been applying to his own progress was revealed as insufficient, and the revelation sat in his chest like a stone, heavy, cold, immovable. Sakura's hands were over her mouth. Her eyes above her fingers were the size of coins. She had watched Naruto catch a Sannin by the face and tear his arms off with the effort most people apply to opening a stubborn jar, and the processing power her mind was dedicating to making that event compatible with her existing worldview was consuming every available resource. She sat down on the branch because her legs had made the decision for her. The forest was still. The killing intent was gone. The birds, with the caution of animals that have survived by knowing when to stay silent, waited another full minute before resuming their songs. Team 7 reached the tower within the allotted time. The preliminary rounds passed without incident, or rather, without incident that concerned Naruto. The other matches played out as they were always going to play out. Genin fighting Genin, ambition versus ambition, technique versus technique, the small violences that the exam system used to sort its participants into categories. Naruto watched from the balcony with the patience of a man watching children play a game whose rules he had written in another lifetime. The finals were held in a stadium that seated 10,000. Civilians occupied the upper tiers. Shinobi filled the lower sections. The Kaji booth sat at the top of the northern wall, containing the third Hokage, his advisors, and in the adjacent section the Kazekage, or the figure wearing the Kazekage's robes, whose spiritual signature Naruto had tagged from across the arena the moment he set foot on the floor. He said nothing about it. The disguise would reveal itself in its own time. Cogs did not adjust the machine. They turned when the machine required turning. The bracket was posted. Naruto Uzumaki versus Neji Hyuga. First match. Neji entered from the eastern gate. He walked with the bearing of someone who had been told since birth that excellence was his birthright and suffering was his inheritance, and who had welded those two truths together into a philosophy that sealed every exit and called the sealed room destiny. His Byakugan was active. The veins around his eyes were raised, the pupils taking in everything within their full range with the resolution of a system that had been bred for ocular supremacy across generations. He looked at Naruto and saw the chakra network, or what he interpreted as one. The energy running through the boy's body registered on the Byakugan as something denser and stranger than anything Neji had observed in any opponent, any instructor, any Hyuga elder. It moved through the Tenketsu points like a river being forced through channels designed for a creek. Too much volume, too much pressure, the channels straining at their limits. Neji processed this and dismissed it. He had processed and dismissed many things. It was, in his view, what prodigies did. Fate has already decided this match, Neji said. His voice carried across the arena with the clarity of conviction. You were born without talent, without lineage, without the eyes that see the truth. The gap between us was decided at birth. A failure cannot defeat a genius. This is the nature of destiny. The stadium held its collective breath. 10,000 people, waiting to see how the dead last would respond to being told his life was already written. Naruto looked at Neji for a long moment. Those ancient, unreadable eyes read the soul behind the speech. A gifted boy who was suffering and had chosen suffering as his worldview because it was the only framework that made the pain make sense. He saw the grief for a father lost to a system that valued bloodline over person. He saw the rage that had crystallized around that grief like armor. He saw the philosophy that gave the armor a name and called the name truth. He saw all of it. He considered it with the thoroughness of someone who had been considering human grief for longer than most civilizations lasted. I watched everyone I ever loved die over centuries. His voice was flat. The words hit the air and the air held them the way a river holds a stone, absorbing the weight, letting it, carrying it forward. Don't talk to me about destiny. You're just throwing a tantrum. The stadium went still. In the Kaj booth, Hiruzen Sarutobi's fingers tightened on his armrest. The sentence had reached him across the full distance of the arena, and something in the boy's voice, the gravity of it, the absolute absence of performance, landed in a place that the Hokage reserved for information he could not dismiss. The boy was 12 years old. The voice belonged to something that should not have fit inside 12 years. Neji attacked. The gentle fist came forward in the form it was always going to take. The Hyuga clan's supreme taijutsu system. designed to bypass external defenses entirely and strike the internal chakra network through the tenketsu points. Neiji's hands moved with the fluid, lethal confidence of someone the entire clan had designated a prodigy. 8 trigrams, 64 palms, 2 palms. The first strikes connected with Naruto's chest and shoulders. The tenketsu points closed, the energy stuttered at the impact sites. 4 palms, abdomen and ribs, each strike placed with targeting accuracy refined across generations. 8 palms. The tempo increased. Neiji's hands were a blur, each strike landing on its designated point, each point closing under the impact, at the sequence building toward the grand total of 64 closures that would shut down a human body's entire energy system. 16 palms. 32 palms. Acceleration. The rhythm of a prodigy performing the technique he was born to perform. Every strike confirming what he already believed, that the outcome was written before the first palm connected. 64 palms. The final strike landed. Neji stepped back. His breathing was marginally elevated but composed. By every metric the Byakugan provided, the boy in front of him should have been on the ground. His network sealed at 64 points, his body unable to circulate the force required to stand. Naruto stood exactly where he had been standing before the first strike connected. Every point was open. The reverse curse technique had activated at the moment of contact for each strike. 64 times, 64 reversals, each closure repaired before Neiji's hand withdrew from the hit. The Byakugan showed it in real time. A network being shut down and restored simultaneously, the closures flickering like lights signaling where someone was turning the switches back on faster than they could be flipped off. Neiji's expression changed. The confidence that had been seated behind his Byakugan like a wall shifted. A small movement, barely visible, but there. He had thrown the full force of the 8 trigrams against a target and achieved nothing. The technique that defined his identity, the inherited art of a clan that measured its worth in the destruction it could deliver through an open palm. 0 effect. He was looking at 64 points his technique had touched, and each one had refused to stay sealed for longer than the duration of the strike itself. His hands came up. His stance reset. The prodigy in him refused to accept the data. Naruto stepped into his guard. The distance between them vanished. Naruto's right fist drew back, short, compact, the kind of punch that belongs to someone who has thrown so many across so many centuries that the movement has been distilled to its minimum viable form. Naruto threw the divergent fist. Neji blocked it. His forearm came up and intercepted the fist at the correct angle, distributing the force across his guard. His Byakugan read the impact, strong but manageable, within the range his body could absorb. The corner of his mouth moved upward by a millimeter, the involuntary gesture of a body expressing the superiority the mind had already concluded. Too weak, he said. The half-second passed. The cursed energy impact arrived. The divergent fist's true force, the delayed shockwave, the second payload that arrived a physical hit and treated the block as if it were not there, erupted through Neiji's guard, through his forearm, through every layer of defense his stance provided, and detonated outward from his center. The energy traveled through his body in a wave that rearranged his internal geography, and the force that exited through his back launched him across the arena like a stone from a sling. Neji hit the far wall. The stone cracked in a 4-foot radius around the impact. Dust erupted. The sound echoed across the stadium with the finality of a door being shut by someone who will never open it again. 10,000 people saw it happen. 10,000 people experienced the same sequence. The block, the smile, the half-second of nothing, and then the eruption that ended the fight with the emphasis of a period at the end of a sentence that has been building for the entire page. In the reserved section, Hyuga elders sat with expressions that ranged from incomprehension to something dangerously close to alarm. The gentle fist had failed. The 8 trigrams, 64 palms, the cornerstone of their clan's combat supremacy, the technique they had been refining for generations, had failed against a boy with neither bloodline nor clan backing nor visible heritage of any kind. The implications rippled through the elder section in a current of stiffened spines and tightened jaws and hands gripping armrests as if the seats beneath them were shifting. Among the Konoha Jinin, Shikamaru Nara leaned forward, an action so contrary to his established behavior that Choji, sitting beside him, forgot to chew. Rock Lee's hands were white-knuckled on the railing, his eyes fixed on the crater where Neji, the rival he had trained his entire life to surpass, was slumped and unmoving. Shino Aburame's insects had retreated into his coat. In her seat to the west, Hinata Hyuga sat with her hands in her lap and her Byakugan active. She had watched every strike of the 64 palms connect and achieve nothing. She had watched Neji, the cousin designated her superior since birth, whose genius the clan referenced with the same certainty they referenced the sunrise, be thrown across the arena by a single punch. Her hands were trembling. Her Byakugan showed her everything. Naruto walking toward the crater with the unhurried gait of someone for whom the outcome had been decided before the first palm was thrown. The trembling was something more complex than she had the vocabulary to name. It was awe, and it was recognition, and it was the first fracture in a belief system that had been telling her she was less than she was for her entire life. Naruto walked to where Neji had landed. The prodigy was conscious, barely, his Byakugan flickering, his body reporting damage in places the gentle fist had never taught him to protect. Naruto drove his fist into the earth beside the boy's head. The ground fractured in a radius of 6 feet. The crater was a statement. This is what I chose to do next to your head instead of to your head, and the distance between those two choices is the whole of my mercy. The match is over, the proctor announced, and his voice carried the slight tremor of a man who had been officiating fights for 15 years and had never seen one end like this. Naruto turned away. Neji stared up at the sky above the stadium, a sky that looked the same as it had before the match, unchanged, indifferent. And something in the way he stared at it was different from the way he had stared at anything before. The cage he had built around the world was the same size it had always been. But for the first time, standing inside it felt like a choice rather than a sentence. The crowd's noise rebuilt itself in layers, murmurs, then exclamations, then the full-throated roar of 10,000 people who had come to see fights and witnessed, instead, something that would redefine what they considered possible. The sound washed over the arena in a wave, and Naruto walked through it the way he walked through everything, without acknowledgement, without acceleration, at the steady pace of a cog that would continue turning regardless of the noise the machine made around it. The remaining matches proceeded. The bracket advanced. The schedule held. And then the invasion began. It started with a feather, a single white feather, drifting down from above the Kaji booth, carrying a genjutsu so sophisticated that it put half the stadium to sleep before it touched the ground. The civilians slumped. The genin who lacked the training to recognize the technique followed. The shinobi who were awake enough to dispel it found themselves awake inside a war. Sand shinobi materialized on the walls. Sound ninja breached the eastern gate. The barrier team around the Kaji booth activated their technique, sealing the Hokage inside a purple energy field with the figure in the Kazekage's robes, who was, as Naruto had known for hours, Orochimaru, wearing a dead man's face the way he wore everything, as a means to an end, as another body to discard when its utility expired. The village erupted. Naruto felt it all through his soul perception, the surge of violence radiating outward from a dozen points simultaneously, the killing intent of 100 combatants saturating the air, the fear of 10,000 civilians who had come for entertainment and found themselves inside a nightmare. He processed it with the speed of someone who had processed invasions before, in other cities, in other centuries. In wars that made this one look like a minor border incident, he prioritized. Gaara of the desert was fracturing. Naruto had been watching the boys since the preliminary rounds, watching the sand that moved without being directed, the killing intent that leaked from his body like radiation from a cracked vessel, the soul tangled behind those ringed, sleepless eyes. Gaara's spirit was wound together with something else, something massive and ancient and furious, a construct of compressed hatred sealed inside him at birth, pressing against the seal's boundaries every waking moment. The One Tail, Shukaku, a tailed beast born from collective malice, given form and hunger, and an appetite that made Gado's army look like a children's game. The shell of composure Gaara had been maintaining, brittle, thin, held together by fear and the reputation his presence generated, finally cracked. The sand exploded outward from his body in a wave that buried the arena floor in 3 inches of grit, and the transformation began. It built upward. The sand assembled itself around Gaara's body like a cocoon, then expanded beyond the cocoon into something larger. Limbs forming, a torso taking shape, a head emerging with a mouth wide enough to swallow a building, and eyes that were hollow and golden and filled with the simple, total desire to reduce everything within reach to rubble. The full Shukaku form, a sand demon the size of a city block, standing in the center of Konoha's invasion with the weight of a geological event and the intent of something that had been waiting for this moment since the day it was sealed. Anbu teams on the rooftops froze. Jonin evacuating civilians stopped and looked up at the thing blotting out the sun. Sand shinobi who had been fighting alongside their Jinchuriki watched the transformation and experienced, for the first time, the full reality of the weapon their village had been pointing at Konoha. A weapon that did not distinguish between targets, that treated allies and enemies with identical contempt. Naruto stood in front of it. Alone, he had left the arena floor and moved through the chaos with the efficiency of someone who had been navigating battlefields since before anyone in this village was born. He stood on the rubble of a collapsed wall, looking up at the Shukaku form, and the size of the thing registered on his face as nothing more than a variable. He had fought larger. He had fought stronger. He had stood before entities that would have used this tailed beast as a warm-up exercise and resolved them with techniques this world had never seen. He did not call for backup. He assessed the situation and concluded that backup would be in the way. You are a curse born of human hatred. His voice carried. It carried upward, past the sand construct's torso, past its massive arms, past the hollow golden eyes, and it landed in the space where Gaara's consciousness was still trapped inside the transformation. A boy buried inside a monument to his own village's fear. A child who had been made into a weapon before he was old enough to understand what a weapon was. Naruto spoke to both of them, the beast and the boy, and the sentence acknowledged the truth of both. He formed a hand sign. His fingers moved into a configuration that existed in no Konoha scroll, no Suna archive, no record maintained by any hidden village on any continent. It was inherited. It was ancient. It came from the memory of a domain architecture built by the King of Curses and then, across centuries of mastery, reconstructed by the soul inhabiting this body into something that reflected a different purpose. The understanding that power, wielded with enough precision of intent, could separate the curse from the victim without destroying either. Domain expansion. The air changed. Something vast manifested behind him. A shrine rising from the ground at accelerated speed. Pillars of bone-white stone streaked with red. Surfaces that seemed to exist at a slight angle to the reality around them. Architecture that belonged to no school of human design. The aesthetic was alien and beautiful and wrong in the way that things built by a consciousness operating on a fundamentally different set of principles are wrong. Pillars curving in ways that pleased the eye while disturbing something deeper. Surfaces that hummed with stored energy at a frequency felt in the marrow rather than heard in the ear. The domain expanded outward. It encompassed the Shukaku form. It encompassed the rubble, the walls, the air above them. The sky within its range shifted. The blue replaced by something deeper, something that vibrated at a register below sound, something that communicated a single truth to everything within its boundaries. You are inside a space where one will is absolute, and that will belongs to Naruto Uzumaki. Benevolent Shrine. The slashes arrived, millions of them. Invisible, microscopic, each one carrying an output adjusted with the kind of targeting resolution that centuries of combat experience had made instinctual rather than effortful. They threaded through the Shukaku's sand construct the way light threads through a prism, entering from every angle simultaneously, passing through the material, finding the lines of connection between the tailed beast's chakra and Gaara's body. They cut those lines. Each slash severed a connection. The tailed beast's chakra, the massive, ancient, furious energy pouring through Gaara's seal and sustaining the construct, was stripped from the boy's system in threads and clusters, peeled away with the care of someone who had spent centuries learning how to cut what needed to be cut and leave what needed to remain. The sand construct lost cohesion. Its limbs stopped holding their shape. The massive arms sagged and collapsed, pouring downward in cascades of loose sand that hit the ground with the sound of a beach being dumped from a height. The torso followed. The head, those hollow golden eyes, that enormous mouth, crumbled inward, features losing definition, as the chakra maintaining them was severed from the source. The construct fell apart in stages, each stage marking another cluster of connections being cut, and within 8 seconds of the domain's activation, the full Shukaku form, a tailed beast manifestation capable of leveling a district, was a hill of loose sand in the middle of Konoha, settling and shifting in the afternoon light. Gaara fell from the height. His body emerged from the collapsing sand in freefall. A 13-year-old boy, thin, pale, the rings around his eyes more pronounced than ever. His expression carrying the blank shock of someone ripped from a nightmare and deposited into waking life without transition. He hit the earth. He was breathing. He was whole. His body was intact, his mind was present, and the drowning pressure of the tailed beast's chakra that had been overwhelming his consciousness was gone. Cut away by slashes so fine that Gaara's own system bore 0 collateral damage. The domain faded. The shrine receded into the ground as if being unbuilt. Pillars descending, surfaces folding inward, the alien architecture withdrawing from reality the way a tide withdraws from shore. The sky returned to its original blue. The hum and the bones ceased. The world resumed its standard parameters, and the people inside the domain's former range found themselves standing in a version of reality that felt, by comparison, thin and provisional and fragile. Naruto walked to where Gaara had landed. The sand was still shifting beneath his feet, residue of the construct's collapse settling into the cracks of the ruined street. He looked down at the boy on the ground, a boy turned into a weapon by a village that feared him. A child filled with a curse before he understood what a curse was. A container treated as the thing he contained for so long that the distinction had eroded to nothing. Naruto understood that boy. He understood him across a distance measured in lifetimes. He said nothing. There was nothing to say that the moment did not already hold. On the rooftops, Anbu operatives stood frozen in postures that ranged from rigid attention to visible shock. They had been trained to observe extraordinary events, to report, to maintain composure. What they had just observed exceeded their training by a margin they lacked the terminology to express. The domain, a technique with no classification, no precedent, no equivalent in any scroll they had access to, had manifested behind a 12-year-old boy and disassembled a tailed beast manifestation with the efficiency of something that had been resolving threats of this magnitude since before their organization was founded. Their reports would contain phrases like unable to classify and recommend immediate Kage-level review. And those phrases would be, by a significant margin, the most honest things any of them had ever filed. Jonin stood in the streets and stared at the space where the domain had been. Some had been shinobi for 20 years. Some had fought in wars. Some had encountered tailed beasts in contexts where the survival rate was measured in single-digit percentages. None of them had ever seen a tailed beast brought down in 8 seconds by a child standing alone. The sand shinobi, who had entered Konoha as invaders and were now standing in the rubble of an invasion that had stalled, watched their Jinchuriki lying on the ground, breathing, untransformed, defeated by something their intelligence briefings had failed to mention in even the most peripheral terms. The strategic calculations that had justified the invasion, the belief that Shukaku's power, properly unleashed, would overwhelm Konoha's defenses, had been made null by a boy who had treated their ultimate weapon as a problem to be solved and solved it in the span of a held breath. Hiruzen Sarutobi, from within the barrier where he fought Orochimaru, had felt the domain's activation. He had felt it in his marrow. That frequency, that hum, the sensation of a different set of laws overriding the ones he had lived under for 7 decades. He had glanced, for a fraction of a second, away from his battle and toward the source, and the expression on his face in that fraction was one he had never worn. It was the face of a man who had dedicated his life to understanding the forces that shaped the shinobi world and had been shown, without preamble, that his understanding had a ceiling he had never touched. The invasion ended in stages. The barrier around the Kage booth collapsed when Orochimaru's arms, reconstituted through forbidden jutsu but still carrying the soul damage Naruto had inflicted in the forest, failed at the moment they were needed most. The Sannin retreated, his body broken and his plans in ruins. The sand and sound forces withdrew. The village stood, damaged but alive, and the people within it began the work of counting their dead and assessing what had happened and trying, with the inadequate instruments of language and experience, to put a name to the thing that had stood between them and annihilation. In the aftermath, the village talked. They talked in the markets, in the hospitals, in the bars, in the homes, and the spaces where civilians gather to process events that exceed their individual capacity to hold. They talked about the domain, the alien shrine, the sky shifting, the tailed beast collapsing in seconds. They talked about the boy at the center. The tone they used when they spoke his name had changed. The word Naruto carried a weight now that it had never carried before, and the people who spoke it could feel that weight in their mouths. Some of them feared it, some were grateful for it. All of them understood, at a level that required no explanation, that the thing living in their village was something their village had never contained. Weeks passed, the village rebuilt, the dead were buried. The negotiations between Sand and Leaf proceeded with the stiffness of nations that had been trying to destroy each other minutes earlier and were now being asked to find common ground. The Hokage seat was transitioning. Hiruzen had survived, barely, the wounds from Orochimaru's assault aging him beyond what his body could sustain. The village kept turning. The machine kept running. Naruto sat on the Hokage monument and watched the lights below. He had been coming here more often since the invasion. The stone faces of the Hokage were cold against his back, and the wind at this altitude carried the smell of the village and the forests and the mountains beyond. And if he closed his eyes, he could almost mistake it for another place, another time, another village, built on the hope that walls could keep the horror out. He did not close his eyes. He had stopped closing his eyes a very long time ago. Sasuke Uchiha was spiraling. It had begun in the forest of death and accelerated through every subsequent event with the momentum of something that had found its trajectory and intended to follow it into the ground. Orochimaru's absence, the curse mark that was never planted because the Sannin never got close enough, had rerouted the obsession without eliminating it. Without the mark's influence, without the external pull of a seal designed to exploit grief and ambition, and the hunger for power that lives inside every person who has lost everyone they loved, Sasuke's spiral was entirely his own. It was fueled by nothing except the choices he made and the comparisons he drew, and the corrosive conclusion those comparisons produced. He had watched Naruto in the Bell test and seen something he could not replicate. He had watched Naruto on the bridge and seen something he could not approach. He had watched Naruto in the forest and seen a Sannin flee from a force he could not comprehend. He had watched the finals and seen the Hyuga prodigy thrown across an arena by something he could not classify. He had watched the invasion and seen a tailed beast rendered to loose sand by a domain he could not imagine. And through all of it, through every display, every escalation, every revelation that the boys sitting beside him in team formations operated so far above the ceiling, Sasuke was struggling to reach, that the ceiling itself was invisible from where Naruto stood. Sasuke had been running the same equation, the same broken, desperate, self-annihilating equation, that grief and obsession and the loneliness of the last Uchiha had been cycling in the background of his mind since the night his brother killed everyone he had ever known. If I am not strong enough, I will never avenge them. If I cannot close the gap, Itachi will remain beyond my reach. If I stay here in this village, following this path, I will die ordinary and my clan will have been erased for nothing, and the rage that has been holding me upright will have been for nothing, and the entire nightmarish sentence of my life will amount to nothing. The logic was broken. The conclusion it produced was poison. And Sasuke followed it the way people follow broken logic, when the alternative is admitting that the thing driving them has no destination. Completely, without reservation, past the point of return. He defected on a night when the moon was full, and the village gates were staffed by Chunin still recovering from the invasion's losses. He walked out of Konoha, carrying only his weapons and the weight of a decision that had been building for months. He walked towards sound, toward whatever power Orochimaru could offer, toward the promise that somewhere, out there, beyond the walls and the rules and the teammates he could not bear to face anymore, there existed a version of strength that would close the gap and make the equation balance. Naruto tracked him. He did not need to be told. He felt Sasuke leave the village through his soul perception, felt the boy's spirit pulling away from Konoha like a thread being drawn from a garment, the connection thinning, the distance growing with each step. He stood up from the monument and looked in the direction Sasuke was traveling, and he knew, with the certainty of someone who had watched this story play out 1,000 times across 1,000 years, where it was headed and how it would end if he did not intervene. He followed. The Valley of the End opened before him like a wound in the landscape. The waterfall poured between two massive statues, Hashirama Senju and Madara Uchiha, carved into the cliff face at a scale designed to remind every person who passed through this place that the village was built on a fracture, that its founding was an act of will imposed on a division that had never fully healed. The water fell between them with the sound of something permanent, something that would continue falling long after the men it honored were forgotten. Sasuke stood on the water at the base of the falls. His reflection rippled beneath him. His Sharingan was active, the Tomoe spinning with the frantic energy of a system pushed past its recommended output. His chakra was ragged. He had been running for hours, burning through reserves he could not afford to spend. The desperation was visible in every line of his body, the set of his jaw, the tremor in his hands, the way his weight shifted between his feet as if the surface beneath him were unstable. He heard Naruto arrive. He turned. "I'll kill you to get your power, Naruto!" The words echoed off the cliff face, and the water and the stone faces of men who had stood in this exact place and had this exact conversation in a different form, a different century, a different iteration of the cycle the shinobi world seemed unable to break. Sasuke's voice cracked on the last syllable. The crack was involuntary, and it revealed, in the fraction of a second it took to happen, everything the boy was trying to hide beneath the anger and the Sharingan and the killing intent he was projecting with the desperation of someone trying to fill a cathedral with a candle. Naruto looked at him. What crossed his face was grief. The grief of a man who has watched this exact collapse happen across centuries. The gifted, wounded, desperate person standing on the edge of the abyss and calling the fall a choice. He had seen it in sorcerers who consumed cursed spirits for power. He had seen it in allies who turned to techniques their bodies were never meant to survive. He had seen it in friends, in people he loved, standing on this same precipice, wearing this same expression, making this same declaration with this same fractured conviction. He had watched the outcome every single time. The outcome had never once been different. He mourned the boy's fall. He mourned it thoroughly, in the space of a single breath. The way you mourn something already in progress, the way you grieve a loss occurring in real time before your eyes. The grief moved through him and settled into the place where all his grief lived, the place that had been accumulating weight for longer than any human being should survive to accumulate it, and then it was done. I've seen too many people lose their humanity for power. His voice carried across the water. It carried with the weight of every time he had said something like this to someone like Sasuke, in a place like this, at a moment like this. I won't let you become a curse. Sasuke's Sharingan spun faster. The Tomoe blurred. His hands moved through signs, bird, ox, dog, rabbit, and the sound of 1,000 birds erupted from his left hand. Chidori. The technique Kakashi had taught him, the technique he had forced past its intended output through sheer will and desperation, and the killing intent of a boy who had decided the only way forward was through the person standing in front of him. The lightning was wrong. It had gone past the blue-white of the standard Chidori and into something else. A black-purple corona of energy that crackled and spat and wrapped around his arm like a living thing. The chakra feeding it was twisted past its natural state by the intensity of the emotion behind it, corrupted by desperation and rage, and the willingness to burn whatever he had left if burning was what it took. The sound was no longer the sound of birds. It was the sound of something tearing. Sasuke charged. He crossed the water with everything he had. His feet struck the surface and launched him forward in a line so straight and so fast that the water beneath his path parted in a trench that filled in behind him. The Chidori led, left arm extended, lightning concentrated at a point designed to punch through anything. The killing intent behind it sufficient to collapse the rational thought of anyone standing in its way. Naruto activated flowing red scale, stack. The reinforcement hit his body in a wave that traveled from his core to his extremities in less than a heartbeat. Every muscle fiber, every tendon, every connective structure hardened and amplified and reached its ceiling. The maximum output of a body augmented by the full reserve of cursed energy that had been building since the soul that produced it first opened its eyes centuries ago. The air around him distorted. The water beneath his feet compressed into a depression 3 inches deep. He matched Sasuke's speed. He closed from his side, meeting the charge at its midpoint. And when Sasuke's Chidori reached his right hand, Naruto caught it. His bare hand closed around the lightning. The technique shredded his palm. The Chidori was designed to cut through anything it touched, and it delivered on that design. Flesh parting, skin splitting, tendons separating, bones cracking under the voltage. Blood erupted and met the lightning and vaporized on contact. The reverse curse technique closed the wound in the same fraction of a second. Skin sealed, tendons reconnected, bone reformed. The blood stopped, the flesh healed. The shredding and the repairing happened simultaneously in the same instant, so fast that the only visible evidence of the cycle was smoke and white steam rising from Naruto's closed fist. A hand being destroyed and rebuilt in a loop so rapid it existed below the threshold of observation, holding lightning that could not make up its mind about whether it was damaging something or being tolerated by something that had decided damage was irrelevant. Sasuke's eyes went wide. His Sharingan tracked the healing, the impossible speed of the regeneration, the flesh knitting in real time around the lightning. His technique was producing, the wound opening and closing faster than his technique could sustain its destructive output. His arm was extended. His hand was inside Naruto's fist. His most powerful attack was being held like a trapped animal, and the cage was made of something that could not be broken because it was already breaking and rebuilding faster than the breaking could matter. Naruto pulled him forward, a tug on the arm. Simple. Sasuke's weight shifted. His balance, already compromised by the full commitment of the charge, tipped past recovery. He stumbled forward, off axis, center of gravity, somewhere past his leading foot, and the Chidori sputtered and died in Naruto's grip because the concentration powering it had fractured along with the boy's footing. Naruto wound up his right fist. The cursed energy compressed around his arm in a distortion visible from every angle. A warping of the air that turned the space around his knuckles into something existing at a slight remove from the reality surrounding it. Black sparks crawled across his fist. They moved with the unhurried certainty of something that knew exactly where it was going and what it would do when it arrived. The air compressed in a radius. A wrongness built at the point of the fist. A pressure that transmitted outward as the sensation of standing too close to an event about to rewrite the local geography. Sasuke looked into Naruto's eyes from 2 feet away. What he saw was something he had never encountered in any opponent, ally, or person he had ever met. The eyes were ancient. They were heavy with the accumulated experience of lifetimes, and they held, beneath everything, a sadness so vast and so permanent that staring into it felt like staring into an ocean that had been there before the land and would remain long after the land was gone. I am a cog. Naruto's voice was steady. It held nothing resembling malice. It held nothing resembling pleasure or anger or the desperate emotion Sasuke had been riding throughout this encounter. It held the weight of a man who had been delivering this line in various forms to various people for longer than Sasuke's clan had existed. And my role is to crush you right here. Black flash. The fist connected with the center of Sasuke's chest. The impact was not a punch. It was an event. The cursed energy compressed to maximum density at the point of contact detonated with a spatial distortion occurring within 0.00001 seconds of impact. The window so narrow that the laws of physics had to briefly excuse themselves from the area to allow it to happen. Black lightning erupted from the contact point. It erupted outward through Sasuke's chest, through the corrupted chakra architecture he had been running on, through the rage and the grief and the desperate ambition fueling his defection, and it erupted inward, past the physical layers, past the chakra network, into the spiritual foundation beneath everything. The impact hit Sasuke's soul. The corrupted chakra burned away. The black-purple energy distorting his system, the residue of pushing his body past its limits in pursuit of power it was never designed to channel, was scoured clean by the Black Flash's detonation. The Sharingan lost its spin. The Tomoe slowed, stuttered, stopped. Sasuke's eyes returned to their natural black in the half-second between the impact and the moment his consciousness departed. The shockwave traveled outward from the point of contact. It crossed the water's surface in an expanding ring that flattened the waterfall's turbulence into glass for a full second before the water reasserted itself. It hit the cliff face behind the valley. It hit the statue of Madara Uchiha. The statue fractured. The stone face, the monument to the founder's rival, the carved testament to the vision that had birthed the village and haunted it ever since, cracked along a line running from the jaw to the crown. The crack widened. Pieces of stone the size of houses separated from the cliff face and fell, spinning into the water below. The splash sent a wall of white 30 feet into the air. The waterfall, diverted by the falling stone, ceased flowing through its original channel and poured instead over the new rubble, finding new paths, creating new patterns, rewriting the geography of a place that had been fixed since the day the statues were carved. The Valley of the End was no longer the place it had been 10 seconds ago. Sasuke was unconscious before he hit the water. His body fell backward from the force of the impact, arms spread, eyes closed, the expression on his face carrying the strange peace of someone relieved of a burden they were never meant to bear. The water received him gently, gentler than anything that had preceded it, and he floated on the surface, face up, breathing. Naruto reached down and pulled him out. He held the boy the way you hold someone who nearly stopped being a person, with both arms, with the full support of a body still running at maximum output because the flowing red scale had not been released, with the tenderness of someone who understood, from centuries of experience, that saving a life was the easy part, and everything that came after was the work that never ended. Sasuke's head rested against Naruto's shoulder. The boy weighed almost nothing. The weight of a 12-year-old body, wet and unconscious, bearing the residue of a fight that had rewritten the landscape around it. Naruto stood in the wreckage of the Valley of the End. The smoke was clearing. The rubble of Madara's statue lay in the water around him, pieces of carved stone jutting from the surface at angles that made the river look like a ruin of itself. The waterfall was gone, diverted, scattered, reduced to a dozen smaller falls, pouring over new stone in patterns that would take years to settle into permanence. The surviving statue, Hashirama the First, the man who believed unity could overcome division, looked out over the changed landscape with the same expression it had always worn, unchanged by the violence that had occurred beneath it. The sound of the river running through rubble filled the valley. It was the sound of the world absorbing what had happened and continuing. Water finding its path regardless of what was placed in the way, because water does not stop for stone. It moves around it. It moves through it. It moves. Naruto stood in that sound, carrying Sasuke, bearing the weight of a soul that had been saving the world for longer than this world knew it needed saving. The smoke cleared around him in wisps. The late afternoon sun found gaps in the haze and reached him in shafts of gold that caught the steam still rising from his healed hand and turned it luminous. His face was the face it always was, dull eyes, an expression that held nothing you could name and everything you could feel. The wariness of a man who has been standing at the end of the world for so long that the end has become a location he recognizes, a place he knows by the smell of the air and the quality of the light and the specific silence that follows the specific violence that brings him here, again, every time, without end. A cog turns. That is what cogs do. It does not ask why the machine requires its turning. It does not ask how long the rotation will continue. It does not ask whether the machine deserves the effort. It turns. Naruto carried Sasuke out of the Valley of the End. The path back toward Konoha was long, and the boy in his arms was breathing, and the smoke was clearing, and the world, this new, strange, familiar world that had given him a new body and a new name and the same old weight, was waiting. He walked. The river ran behind him through the rubble of what the valley used to be. The sun moved in the sky the way the sun always moves, without opinion, without memory, without grief. Naruto carried all three. The river ran through rubble that had been a statue an hour ago. The sound it made was the sound of the world adjusting to a new arrangement of itself, water finding channels between stones that had been carved to honor a man whose monument was now gravel and sediment, and the evidence of a fist thrown by a boy carrying a soul older than the stone. Naruto stood in the wreckage with Sasuke's weight against his chest, the unconscious boy breathing in shallow, even intervals. The exhale warm against Naruto's collarbone, and the valley was changed, and the valley would stay changed, because some changes do not ask permission and do not reverse. He began walking. The path from the Valley of the End to the village gates of Konoha ran through 70 miles of fire country forest, cedar and pine and the thick undergrowth of a land that had never been tamed in full, where the trees grew so tall, their canopy turned the forest floor into a place of dappled green shadow, and the kind of silence that exists only where human civilization has declined to build. Naruto carried Sasuke through it. The boy weighed less than the pack. Naruto had carried through other forests, in other lifetimes, through wars this continent had never imagined. He adjusted his grip once during the first hour to keep Sasuke's head from tilting backward. And the adjustment was the gesture of someone who had carried the unconscious and the wounded so many times that the ergonomics of it were reflex. Where to hold, how to distribute weight, the angle that kept the carried person's neck from straining. The forest watched. It watched the way forests watch, through the attentiveness of animals that have learned to go still when something significant passes through their territory. Birds stopped singing on the branches above and resumed singing on the branches behind, a rolling silence that moved with him through the canopy like the wake of a ship cutting through green water. Deer froze at the tree line and did not resume moving until his footsteps were too far away to feel through the earth. The forest knew what was walking through it. Forests have known these things for longer than people have known how to ask. Sasuke stirred once, in the third hour, a sound that was almost a word, shaped by lips that were cracked and dry. The Sharingan behind his closed lids flickered. Naruto's soul perception read the flicker as a brief, involuntary activation of the dojutsu responding to some fragment of a dream. And then it stilled, and the boy slept again, and Naruto walked on through the trees. He arrived at the village gates in the gray margin between night and dawn when the sky held a color that belonged to neither, and the air carried the chill of a world that had been cooling since sunset and had arrived at its lowest temperature. The gates were manned. They were always manned. But the faces at the gates tonight were different from the usual rotation. Harder, more alert. The faces of shinobi who had been told that a genin had defected and another genin had pursued and neither had returned, and who had spent the hours since that report constructing, in the privacy of their own imaginations, every possible version of what might come walking back through those gates and bracing themselves for the worst ones. Naruto walked through the gates carrying Sasuke Uchiha on his back, and the worst versions evaporated. The first Anbu materialized from the rooftop to the left, a porcelain mask catching the earliest light, the body behind it rigid with the specific tension of someone who has been holding position for hours and is suddenly confronted with a reason to move. Two more appeared from the right. A Jonin, Naruto recognized the chakra signature as Genma Shiranui, dropped from the guard tower with a senbon still between his teeth and his eyes already running a field assessment of both boys. The assessment took 4 seconds. It returned a result that made Genma remove the senbon from his mouth and hold it at his side, because the thing his assessment had found was a boy standing upright without a scratch on his body, carrying a boy whose chakra network was running cleaner than any medic in Konoha would be able to explain. The Anbu captain spoke first. The voice behind the mask was female, clipped, professional. Status. He's alive, Naruto said. He's clean. His chakra was corrupted. It isn't anymore. He shifted Sasuke's weight by a fraction. He needs a bed and someone to check his hydration. The fighting is done. The Anbu captain looked at him for 3 full seconds before responding. Behind the porcelain, her eyes were doing something she would never admit to in a report. They were trying to reconcile the voice she was hearing with the face she was seeing. And the reconciliation was failing the way all such reconciliations failed when people looked at Naruto and listened to him at the same time. The voice belonged to someone who had been filing after-action reports for decades. The face was 12 years old. She signaled her team. 2 Anbu moved to take Sasuke. Naruto let them. The transfer of weight was smooth. He held the boy until the Anbu had secure grips and then released, and the absence of Sasuke's weight against his body changed nothing about his posture, because his posture had been carrying things heavier than a 12-year-old's body since before the Senju and the Uchiha had learned each other's names. The hospital received Sasuke within 20 minutes. The medic Nin on night rotation, a woman named Ito, whose hands had been steady through 3 wars and who had treated injuries ranging from training scrapes to near-fatal organ damage, ran the standard diagnostic array on Sasuke's chakra network and stopped. She ran it again. She looked at the output. She set her clipboard on the bedside table and stood for a long moment with her hands at her sides, staring at readings that described a system she had never seen. The network was clean. The coils were undamaged. The tenketsu were open, every single one, running at a baseline efficiency that exceeded healthy parameters. The corruption she had been warned about in the pre-mission briefing, the residue of overtaxed chakra and emotional instability that had been building in Sasuke's system for months, was absent. It had been replaced by something she lacked the diagnostic vocabulary to describe: an evenness, a stability, as though someone had taken the boy's entire energy architecture and reset it to its original factory settings with a tool she had never been trained to recognize. Ito wrote her report. The report used the word unprecedented twice, and the phrase recommend further evaluation 3 times, and the hand that wrote it shook at the edges in a tremor she attributed to the late hour and knew, in the part of herself that was honest when the reports were filed, had nothing to do with the late hour. Hiruzen Sarutobi read the report at his desk in the pre-dawn stillness. The office smelled of pipe tobacco and old paper, and the particular staleness of a room where important decisions had been made, and the air had absorbed the weight of them. He read the medic's findings. He read the Anbu captain's after-action assessment. He set both documents on his desk and placed his hands flat on the surface and sat with the information the way a man sits with a truth he has been approaching for a long time and has finally reached. He summoned Naruto. The boy arrived through the office door rather than the window, which was, Hiruzen noted, the choice of someone who understood that the gesture of entering through the door meant something different than the gesture of arriving through the window, and who had chosen the version that communicated respect without performing it. Naruto stood before the Hokage's desk in the clothes he had worn to the valley. The jacket stiff with dried blood that was his own and had been dry since the RCT sealed the wounds it came from. The sandals worn through at the sole. The eyes holding the same ancient weight they had held since the bell test and would hold until something Hiruzen could not imagine found a way to change them. "Sit," Hiruzen said. Naruto sat. The silence between them lasted long enough for the first light of dawn to reach the window and change the quality of the shadows on the desk. Hiruzen did not fill the silence. He let it exist, because he had learned across 7 decades of leadership that the silences before important conversations held their own information. And this silence was telling him that the boy across from him was comfortable inside it, in a way that 7 decades of leadership had never been. "I have been building a theory," Hiruzen said. "Since the Bell test, since the bridge mission, since the Chunin exams, since the invasion, since this morning's report landed on my desk. The theory has been growing larger every time I receive new information, and the information has been getting harder to contain inside any framework I was taught to use." He paused. "I would like you to tell me what you are, Naruto, in your own words, whatever you are willing to share." Naruto looked at the old man. His soul perception read what it always read when he looked Hiruzen. A spirit that had been carrying the weight of a village for too long, worn at the edges, the way all spirits are worn by the sustained effort of caring about things that are harder than they should be. Threaded through with grief for students lost and decisions made, and the specific exhaustion of a man who had been asked to lead twice and had said yes both times, because refusing was never something his character allowed. He looked at all of it. He considered what to share and what to hold, and the consideration took less than a second, because the man sitting across from him had earned the truth by the simple act of asking for it honestly. He told him. He told him about the soul, about the lifetimes, the centuries of them stacked inside him like geological strata, each layer carrying its own weight of memory and loss, and the faces of people whose names this world would never hear spoken. He told him about the cursed energy, about its nature, about the way it differed from what this world called chakra, in the same way an ocean differs from the lakes that border it. The same substance, governed by different laws, operating at a different scale. He told him about the techniques. He told him about the grief. He told him about being a cog, the word he used, the only word he had found in any language across any lifetime that described what he was with the accuracy the description deserved. A cog that turns. A cog that does not choose when or why or for how long. A cog that turns, because that is the entire architecture of its purpose. And the purpose does not require understanding to function. Hiruzen listened without interrupting. His pipe had gone out sometime during the first minute. He held it in his hand, unlit, the way a man holds something familiar when the unfamiliar is pressing in from every direction, and the hand needs something to anchor it. When Naruto finished, the Hokage sat with the information for a span measured in minutes rather than seconds, and the office filled with the weight of what had been said. And the weight was considerable, and Hiruzen held it the way he held every weight that came with the chair, with his spine straight and his hands steady and his eyes carrying the understanding that some things once known restructure everything around them. Then the village owes you an apology it does not know how to give yet, Hiruzen said, but it will learn. Naruto looked at him with those ancient eyes. The corner of his mouth moved. Barely. The village owes me nothing. I was going to do this anyway. Hiruzen nodded. The nod was the nod of a man accepting a statement he recognized as the truth, even though the truth was harder than the alternative. He placed his pipe on the desk. He reached into the drawer and withdrew a clean file folder and opened it and began writing. And what he wrote was the beginning of a restructuring. A set of orders that would change how the Anbu surveilled Naruto, how the council discussed him, how the village's institutional memory would begin, in slow and imperfect increments, to adjust its understanding of the boy who had been carrying it since before it noticed. Sasuke woke the next morning. He woke the way people wake after trauma, in stages, consciousness arriving in layers, each layer bringing with it a new register of awareness that had to be assembled into something coherent before the next layer could land. He felt the hospital bed first, then the light, then the IV in his arm and the residual ache in his chest where the black flash had connected, an ache that lived below the physical, in a place he had never been struck before, and that his body lacked the language to describe. He opened his eyes. Naruto was sitting at the edge of the bed. He was sitting the way he sat in classrooms, spine straight, hands resting on his knees, posture carrying the particular ease of someone whose body has been in so many positions across so many years that all positions feel equally natural and equally temporary. He was looking at Sasuke with an expression that held nothing performative, an expression that was simply the face of someone who had been waiting and was now finished waiting and was ready for whatever came next. Sasuke looked at him. The Sharingan activated by reflex, the Tomoe spinning, reading, processing the cursed energy radiating from the boy at his bedside, and finding it as vast and as incomprehensible as it had been every other time the Sharingan had tried to read it. He let the dojutsu fade. The effort of maintaining it was beyond what his body could sustain this morning, and the information it provided was insufficient to whatever this conversation was going to be. Why? Sasuke said. The word carried everything he could not articulate. The defection, the valley, the Chidori held in a bare hand, the punch that had burned through every corrupted thing inside him and left him clean and empty and lying on the water with the sky above him, and the boy's face the last thing he saw before everything went away. Naruto did not answer the question directly. He answered something beneath it. I know about Itachi, he said. Sasuke's body went rigid. The name hit him the way the name always hit him. A full body response, every muscle tightening, every nerve firing, the grief and the rage and the love and the hatred all arriving at once and occupying the same space inside his chest and fighting for which one would reach his face first. His hands gripped the hospital sheets. The knuckles went white. Naruto told him. He told him what his soul perception had read in the Forest of Death when Orochimaru's spiritual architecture was laid bare by the strike that hit its foundation. The residual information embedded in the Sanin's patchwork soul, the truth of the massacre's origin, the village's order, the Elder Council's mandate, and the boy who had been asked to kill his own family to prevent a war that would have killed everyone's family, and who had said yes because he loved his brother and his village more than he loved himself, and who had carried the weight of that yes through every year since. He told it flat. He told it direct. He trimmed nothing and softened nothing, because Sasuke was a person who needed the truth delivered like a blade, clean, total, immediate, because anything less would have been an insult to the grief the truth was going to produce. Sasuke received it. The processing on his face was visible in the way tectonic motion is visible from the right distance. Vast, slow, the entire landscape of his expression shifting as the information settled into the places where his understanding of the world had been living and rearranged them. The grief hit first, then the recognition, then something worse than both, the understanding that the brother he had built his entire identity around killing all along, the brother who had sacrificed everything, including Sasuke's love, to keep Sasuke alive. The Sharingan activated again, unbidden, and the Tomoe were spinning faster than Sasuke had ever felt them spin, fed by an emotion so concentrated that the dojutsu's evolutionary architecture interpreted it as a survival-level event. He did not speak for a very long time. When he did, what he said was the one sentence his pride and his grief allowed him. I didn't know. I know, Naruto said. Now you do. The room held the words. The morning light through the hospital window held them. The IV drip counted the seconds between the sentences, and each second carried a weight that had nothing to do with time and everything to do with two boys sitting in a room where one had just handed the other the truth about his entire life, and the other was holding it the way people hold things that have changed the shape of their hands. Naruto stood. He moved toward the door. He paused with his hand on the frame, a pause that looked, from Sasuke's perspective, like hesitation, but was actually the pause of a man deciding whether the moment needed one more sentence or whether the silence would carry the rest. He decided. He was falling. I caught him. That's the whole job. The door closed behind him. Sasuke sat in the silence with his hands in his lap and the clean, exhausted chakra running through his system, and the weight of knowing settling into the places where the rage used to live, filling them with something heavier and stranger and infinitely more difficult to carry. The grief of a boy who has just learned that the person he hated most was the person who loved him most, and that the distance between those two facts was the entire span of a life he was going to have to rebuild from the foundation up. The village's response arrived in layers, the way all institutional responses arrive. Through rumor first, then through report, then through the slow and imperfect machinery of official channels, trying to process an event that exceeded every template they had been built to handle. The council convened, the elders argued. Danzo Shimura, whose name lived in the spaces between official records and whose influence moved through the village the way groundwater moves through soil, invisible, pervasive, shaping the landscape from beneath, pushed for Sasuke's detention and Naruto's immediate reclassification as a village asset requiring containment. Hiruzen overruled him with a sentence that arrived in the council chamber with the force of a gavel and the finality of a door being closed. The boy brought our shinobi home alive and undamaged. The village will respond with gratitude, or the village will answer to me. The Anbu filed their reports. The reports contained terms like total engagement cessation and structural alteration to the Valley of the End consistent with S rank or higher offensive output, and recommend immediate reassessment of threat classification parameters. The Anbu, who had been stationed at the valley's perimeter, close enough to feel the shockwave of the black flash that cracked the Madara statue, far enough to have arrived too late to witness the exchange that produced it, included a handwritten addendum to their standard report that read, in its entirety, the target location has been permanently altered. Recommend geological survey. The waterfall is gone. Sakura Haruno stood in the hospital corridor and watched through the window as Naruto walked away from Sasuke's room. She had been there since before dawn, since the word reached her that Sasuke was in the hospital and Naruto had brought him back, since the first breathless relay from a Chunin who had been at the gate and had seen the boy walk through it, carrying his teammate on his back without a wound on his body. She had come here to see Sasuke. She had stayed because what she saw through the window, the conversation, the silence, the way Naruto sat at the bedside with the patience of something that had all the time in the world and had chosen to spend this portion of it here, had rooted her in place with a force she could not name and could not resist. She watched Naruto walk down the corridor. He passed her. He did not stop, but his eyes met hers for a fraction of a second as he passed, and what she saw in them was something that made her press her back against the wall and hold her breath and feel, in the center of her chest, a sensation she would spend years trying to articulate and never fully succeed. The sensation of being looked at by someone who saw her completely, who understood exactly what she was feeling, who held that understanding with a gentleness so total it was almost unbearable, and who kept walking because the gentleness was a thing he carried for everyone and could not afford to set down for any one person. She entered Sasuke's room. She sat in the chair Naruto had vacated. She said nothing because there was nothing to say that the room did not already hold. Outside, the village rebuilt. The invasion's damage was still visible in scaffolding and construction noise, and the particular energy of a population that had been attacked and survived, and was now channeling the survivors' urgency into hammers and nails, and the brick-by-brick reassembly of everything the attack had taken. Civilians who had heard rumors of what happened in the valley talked about it in the markets and the tea shops and the doorways of homes where neighbors gathered to trade information and process fear. The name Naruto Uzumaki moved through these conversations with a different weight than it had carried before the invasion. The weight was complex. It held fear and gratitude and the specific unease of people adjusting to the presence of something they had been wrong about for a very long time and were only beginning to understand the depth of their wrongness. 2 years passed. The village healed. The scaffolding came down. The buildings rose in their new forms, some identical to what had stood before, some changed, because reconstruction always carries the opportunity for revision. And some things, once broken, rebuild into shapes that better serve the present. Sasuke trained. He trained with a focus that had been reforged by the truth Naruto had given him, the Sharingan developing through discipline rather than desperation, the grief for Itachi channeled into something that resembled purpose instead of poison. he was still wounded. The wound was simply pointing in a direction now instead of eating inward. The Manjikyo was still distant, but the path toward it was clean. Naruto waited. He waited the way he always waited, with the specific patience of a cog between rotations, present, aware, his soul perception running at constant baseline, reading the spiritual architecture of the village and the forests and the borders beyond, with the effortless attentiveness of someone who had been monitoring threats since before this civilization developed the concept of a border. He trained in the forests at night. He sat on the Hokage monument in the evenings, watching the lights below, and the expression on his face during those hours was the expression of a man looking at something he has decided to protect without ever needing to explain the decision, because the decision was made before the thing he is protecting existed, and the decision will outlast it. The next turn arrived, the way turns always arrive for a cog, without fanfare, without warning, with the momentum of a machine that has been building toward this rotation since the last one ended. Orochimaru resurfaced. The intelligence reached Konoha through 3 independent channels within the same week: an intercepted sound courier, a defecting subordinate, and a border patrol that stumbled across a supply line running from the land of rivers to a cave network in the mountains between Earth Country and Sound. The supply line carried materials that had one purpose: the construction of a new laboratory. The defecting subordinate confirmed it. Orochimaru was rebuilding. The arms Naruto had torn from him in the forest had been reconstituted through forbidden jutsu. The stolen bodies providing raw material. The regeneration fueled by the same parasitic spiritual architecture that had sustained the Sannin through decades of body theft. The soul damage from Naruto's strike was still present, healed around but never fully repaired, the way a bone that sets improperly carries the fracture's memory in its new shape. And yet the Sannin was rebuilding. He was recruiting. He was, according to every piece of intelligence that reached the Hokage's desk, preparing to make another attempt on Sasuke Uchiha. Naruto read the intelligence reports in Hiruzen's office. He read them the way he read everything related to threats, with the steady attentiveness of someone who has been resolving threats since before paper was invented and who treats the documentation of them as a courtesy rather than a necessity. He set the reports on the desk. "I'll handle it," he said. Hiruzen looked at him. The look contained a question the Hokage did not ask aloud, because the question, "Are you sure?" would have been an insult to both of them. "I know where he is," Naruto said. "I've known since last week. His soul has a signature. I read it in the forest. It's the kind of thing you remember." He left the village the next morning. He traveled alone. He carried nothing except the clothes on his body and the centuries inside his skull, and the cursed energy humming through his bones at a resting level that made the air around him warp in the peripheral vision of anyone standing close enough to notice. The cave network was built into the mountains, the way parasites build into their hosts, occupying existing structures, expanding them, converting the natural architecture of the stone into something that served the occupants' needs while disguising itself from the outside as undisturbed rock. The entrance was concealed behind a waterfall in a valley that appeared on no map maintained by any hidden village. Naruto found it by following the spiritual signature. Orochimaru's soul was a beacon to anyone capable of reading souls, and Naruto was capable of reading souls the way eagles are capable of reading the ground from 1,000 feet above. The details were total, the distance irrelevant. He walked into the cave. The temperature dropped immediately. The stone walls were slick with moisture, and the air carried the smell of preservative chemicals and something organic and wrong. The smell of living things kept in conditions that served a purpose other than their well-being. The corridors branched. Naruto followed the beacon. The Sound Jonin on the outer perimeter found him first. They found him the way prey finds a predator. By the time they were aware of his presence, the relevant decisions had already been made. 4 of them, stationed at a junction where 3 corridors met, each one carrying the forehead protector of the hidden sound and the enhanced physiology of a shinobi who had been modified by Orochimaru's experiments to operate above standard combat parameters. They were fast. They were strong. They had been trained by a Sannin and augmented by a genius and placed here with the express purpose of stopping whatever came through these corridors. Black Flash hit the first one before the Sound Jonin's hand completed the first seal of the jutsu he was forming. The spatial distortion compressed at the point of impact, and the black lightning erupted outward in branching veins that traced the cave walls and through shadows that moved in the wrong direction. The man's body left the ground and struck the stone ceiling, and the stone cracked around the impact, and the man did not return to the floor under his own power. The remaining three experienced a moment of pure recognition, the instant between stimulus and response, where the brain receives information and attempts to file it, and the filing fails, and the failure produces a gap, and in the gap lives the understanding that the situation has exceeded every preparation they brought into it. Dismantle, address the gap. The invisible slashes expanded from Naruto's position in a grid that filled the junction from wall to wall, and the three remaining Sound Jonin were inside the grid before the recognition in their eyes had time to become a decision. The cuts were clean. The geometry was flawless. The targets ceased to be threats in the time between one heartbeat and the next, and the corridor beyond them was open, and Naruto walked through it the way he walked through everything. The experimental subjects came next, things bred in tanks and grown in chambers and fed on concentrated killing intent until their bodies carried the spiritual residue of the malice that had shaped them. They were large. Some were fast. All of them carried the signature of Orochimaru's ambition, the belief that life could be engineered into shapes that served the engineer, that biology was a material to be molded rather than a boundary to be respected. They met Naruto in the corridors, and they met the same result that everything met when it stood between a cog and its next rotation. The summons arrived in a rush of displaced air and killing intent. Serpents, massive and modified, their scales carrying the sheen of something injected into them during their growth, their fangs dripping a venom that Naruto's soul perception read as lethal to anything with a standard circulatory system. They were beautiful in their way. They were also irrelevant. Cleave adjusted to their durability. The enhanced scales, the modified musculature, the venom sacs, and the reinforced skeletal structures. And the adjustment took a fraction of a second, and the result was total. And the summons departed this plane in sections that settled to the stone floor of the corridor with the wet finality of something that had been alive and had encountered a counter-argument it could not survive. Naruto moved through the base with the pace of a man walking to a destination he could see from where he started. The corridors opened into chambers. The chambers contained the evidence of decades of work. Preservation tubes, surgical tables, scroll archives filled with research that represented the accumulated output of a genius who had decided that the boundaries of the human body were suggestions rather than rules. He passed through them without stopping. The work was abhorrent, and it was over, and stopping to examine it would have served nothing except the private revulsion of a man who had seen worse and would see worse again. The innermost chamber was large. The ceiling rose 30 feet above a floor, inscribed with ceiling script so dense it covered every available surface. A mandala of golden characters radiating from a central circle in concentric rings, each ring carrying a different layer of suppressive force. The whole thing designed to work as a single instrument of containment. The script glowed faintly in the chamber's dim light. It was beautiful. It was the most sophisticated ceiling array Naruto had ever seen in this world. And the sophistication spoke to the depth of the fear that had produced it. 2 years of fear, compressed into golden characters, built by a genius who understood that the thing coming for him operated outside every system the genius had spent his life mastering. Orochimaru stood against the far wall. He was different. The body was new, younger, harder, the musculature more defined, the face carrying the cold beauty of a vessel that had been selected for its physical capabilities and then inhabited by something that treated beauty as a tool and the body as a rental. The yellow eyes were the same. The tongue was the same. The soul beneath everything was the same. The patchwork, the stolen lives, the original buried so far beneath the layers that even Orochimaru's own memory of who he had been before the stealing began had degraded to an echo. The array activated, the golden script ignited in sequence, ring by ring, each one flaring to life with a pulse of sealing energy that raced toward the center, toward the circle where Naruto was standing. The activation was instantaneous and total. The script burned along the floor in lines of golden fire that converged beneath Naruto's feet and rose through his body in a lattice of suppressive force, reaching for his energy, searching for the architecture of chakra that every seal in this world had been designed to find and bind. The array was flawless. Every character was placed with the exacting hand of a man who had studied sealing theory at a level that exceeded every active practitioner in the shinobi world. The script reached Naruto. It found his cursed energy. It attempted to grip, and the grip found nothing it recognized. The sealing language was built for chakra. Naruto's energy operated on a framework so far removed from chakra's architecture that the script could find nothing to latch onto, like a hand reaching into fog and closing around the shape of something that was already somewhere else. The golden characters hit the surface of his cursed energy and slid off it the way water slides off stone that has been polished by centuries of contact. The script dimmed. Ring by ring, the golden light sputtered and faded and went out, each ring dying in sequence from the center outward, the mandala unwinding itself as the suppressive force found nothing to suppress, and the energy maintaining the array exhausted itself against a target that existed outside every parameter the array was built to contain. The golden fire died. The chamber floor returned to bare stone. The most elaborate trap Orochimaru had ever constructed lay inert beneath Naruto's feet, and the silence that followed its failure was the silence of a man watching the last wall fall. Naruto looked up. Orochimaru's yellow eyes held the expression of a mind that has run through every contingency and arrived at the end of the list. The genius behind those eyes was working. It was always working. The analytical engine of a man who had spent his life believing that every problem could be solved if the intelligence applied to it was sufficient. And the engine was producing output, and the output said, the trap was the final variable, and the variable has returned 0, and the situation has exceeded the model. He attacked. The 8 branches erupted from his body, a transformation that turned the Sanin's physical form into a hydra of white serpents, each one massive, each one carrying the full weight of Orochimaru's regenerative architecture, each one attacking from a different angle with fangs large enough to swallow a child whole. The technique was his most powerful physical transformation. It was the shape he took when every other option had been exhausted, and the only remaining strategy was overwhelming force. Cleave read the target. The 8 serpentine bodies, their durability, their spiritual architecture, the way Orochimaru's soul was distributed across all 8 forms simultaneously. The reading took a fraction of a second. Cleave adjusted its output to exceed everything it found, and the adjustment was total, and the serpents came apart in a geometry that would have been impressive if there had been anyone present with the analytical framework to appreciate it. 7 of the 8 forms separated into sections that collapsed to the chamber floor. The 8th, the one carrying the primary concentration of Orochimaru's soul, was left intact because Naruto's targeting had found the real body in the first half second of the technique's deployment and had excluded it from the general resolution. Orochimaru's living corpse reincarnation activated. The survival instinct, the deepest one, the one buried beneath the genius and the ambition and the decades of accumulation, fired its final mechanism. The mouth opened. The body split. The pale, glistening form of Orochimaru's true self began to emerge from the shed skin. The serpent sliding from the snake, the thing that had been wearing bodies for so long that the wearing had become its primary mode of existence, attempting the only exit it knew. Naruto's hand closed around the emerging form before it cleared the shed body. He held it. The thing in his grip was smaller than anything Orochimaru projected into the world. A compressed, glistening essence, the distilled output of decades of theft and modification, and the refusal to accept mortality on any terms other than the refuser's own. It writhed. It was strong. Strong in the way that desperate things are strong. Strong in the way that a lifetime of accumulation is strong when it has been compressed into a final form and given the single instruction to survive. Naruto held it without effort. His grip was the grip of something that had held stronger things than this, for longer than this creature had been stealing time. Soul perception read Orochimaru's spirit in that final moment with total, unfiltered resolution. What Naruto saw was the full history of the thing in his hand. Every body it had worn, every life it had consumed, every identity it had digested and incorporated into the patchwork of itself. He saw the original. Somewhere at the center of the construction, beneath the layers of stolen experience and borrowed flesh, the original Orochimaru still existed. A child who had been gifted and lonely and afraid of death. A boy who had found a white snake at his parents' grave and had decided that mortality was a problem that genius could solve. The child was still in there, buried, diminished, surrounded by the accumulated weight of everything the child had grown into, but present. Still present, Naruto looked at the soul and saw the shape of every person who had ever chosen accumulation over acceptance, who had ever decided that the answer to the fear of dying was to become something that could not die, regardless of what had to be consumed in the process. He had seen this shape in sorcerers. He had seen it in curses. He had seen it in beings that had started as human and ended as architecture, structures built from stolen materials, hollow at the center, growing outward forever because growing was the only alternative to facing the emptiness at the core. "You spent lifetimes learning to cheat death," Naruto said. His voice was even. The syllables fell into the chamber's silence and stayed. "I spent lifetimes being it. The difference is that I am better at it than you are." Cleave activated. The output read the spiritual architecture in his hand, every layer, every theft, every stitched seam, and adjusted to exceed it all. The technique passed through Orochimaru's soul from every angle simultaneously, and the seams came apart, and the layers separated, and the thing that had been Orochimaru of the Sannin ceased to cohere. The stolen lives dispersed, dozens of them, released from the construction that had bound them, their residual spiritual energy dissipating into the air of the chamber in a wave of pressure that smelled like ozone and old grief. The original, the child, the core, went with them, because the original and the construction had been intertwined for so long that separating them required separating everything, and the separation was total. The shed skin lay on the chamber floor. The chamber was still. Naruto stood in the stillness for a moment. He looked at the empty shell. He looked at the chamber, the dead ceiling array, the collapsed serpentine forms, the research equipment lining the walls, the accumulated evidence of a mind that had been working toward immortality since the day it discovered that mortality applied to it. He turned and walked back through the corridors, past the resolved threats, past the empty rooms, past the junction where the Sound Jonin had made their stand and found it insufficient. The cave mouth opened onto the valley outside, and the waterfall that hid the entrance was still falling, and the morning light was gray and soft, and the birds were singing the way birds sing when the thing that was keeping them silent has departed from the area. He walked back toward Konoha. The mountains behind him held the cave, and the cave held the remains, and the remains held nothing anymore, and the world had one less thing hiding in its stone. The intelligence networks registered the absence within weeks. The Sound Village's infrastructure, already fragile, already dependent on the singular personality that had created it, collapsed in stages. The lieutenants scattered. The experiments were abandoned. The supply lines dried up. The name Orochimaru transitioned from active threat to past tense in the bingo books of every hidden village on the continent, and the transition was permanent, and the world adjusted to a version of itself that contained one fewer nightmare. Konoha received the confirmation through channels it had been monitoring since Naruto's departure. Hiruzen read the report. He set it on his desk beside the others, the Valley of the End report, the Chunin exam report, the invasion report, and the pile of documents describing things the boy had done was growing into something that resembled less a personnel file and more a geological record. Each entry a new stratum, each stratum carrying a weight that the strata beneath it had been building toward. The months that followed brought a different kind of attention to Konoha's borders. The Akatsuki's intelligence network, a web of informants and intermediaries, and the accumulated surveillance of an organization that had been operating in the shadows of the shinobi world for over a decade, processed the information about Orochimaru's end and produced an assessment that rippled through the organization's hierarchy with the force of a stone dropped into still water. Something in the Land of Fire had resolved one of the Akatsuki's former members, a man who had operated at the summit of individual combat capability. The assessment generated a response. The response generated a mission. The mission was assigned to two of the organization's most capable operatives. Itachi Uchiha and Kasame Hoshigaki traveled toward Konoha's borders with the efficiency of two people who had been moving through hostile territory as a pair for long enough that their coordination existed below the level of conscious decision. Itachi moved on the left, Kasame moved on the right. Samehada rode Kasame's back, its bandaged form shifting with the restless energy of a living weapon that had tasted enough chakra to develop preferences and was always hungry for more. They found the road on the morning of the third day. The road ran through a stretch of fire country forest where the trees were old enough to have been standing when the village was founded, and the canopy above turned the light into something green and heavy. And the air smelled of earth and the particular sweetness of decomposing leaves and the promise of rain. Naruto was standing in the road. He was facing their direction. His hands were in his pockets. His posture carried the loose readiness that every person who had ever stood across from him recognized by instinct. The posture of a body that was relaxed because tension would be wasted effort, because whatever was about to happen had already been decided by a soul that processed incoming threats the way a furnace processes fuel. He had been standing there for 11 minutes. His soul perception had registered their approach when they crossed the border, and the reading had told him everything he needed to know about what was walking toward him. The living sword, the dying prodigy, the grief in one, and the hunger in the other, and the organization behind both of them sending its pieces toward the board's center, because the board's center was where the Nine Tails lived, and the Nine Tails was what they wanted. Kasame saw the boy first. His assessment was instant and professional. Small target, Genin age, alone, standing in a road with the body language of someone who had chosen this ground and was waiting on it. Kasame had seen this posture before. He had seen it in Jonin, who had made the mistake of believing they were the most dangerous thing on their chosen ground. He had corrected the mistake for every one of them. He attacked. Samehada left his back and entered the swing in a single motion, the massive weapon arcing through the air with the force and speed that had made Kasame one of the most feared close combat specialists in the shinobi world. The sword's chakra-draining field expanded as it moved, the living scales reaching outward, pulling energy from the air around the weapon's path like a net dragging through water. The field was wide enough to encompass a 10-foot radius. Anything with a chakra network caught inside that radius would feel its energy being leached through its skin, drained by the sword's parasitic appetite. Naruto stepped inside the field. The draining mechanism reached for his energy and found what the sealing array had found: an ocean where it expected a cup. Samehada's scales made contact with the outer edge of his cursed energy, and the reaction was immediate, violent, and deeply embarrassing for the sword. The scales retracted. The sword's living surface flinched inward, pulling away from the contact the way a tongue pulls away from a surface too hot to bear. Samehada writhed in Kasame's grip, and the writhing was the response of a living thing that had just tasted something it could not process, something so dense and so ancient that the tasting itself had overwhelmed the mechanism that made tasting possible. Kasame's swing continued through the space where Naruto had been standing. The sword met empty air. Naruto was inside his guard, inside the reach of the weapon, inside the radius of the man's enormous physical presence, close enough that Kisame's blue-gray skin was visible in the detail that combat distance reveals, the texture, the sheen of moisture, the way the gill markings on his cheeks flexed with each rapid breath. Naruto looked up at him. "Your sword drinks chakra. Mine drinks the space between heartbeats. You are outmatched in the wrong dimension. Black flash. The fist connected with the center of Kasame's chest, and the spatial distortion compressed at the point of impact within 0.000001 seconds, and the black lightning erupted outward, through the flak vest, through the mesh, through the rib cage and the muscle wall behind it, through the physical layer entirely, and into the spiritual architecture beneath. The black lightning branched across Kasame's body in veins that crossed the width of the road and forked into the tree trunks on either side, leaving char marks in the bark that would remain visible for years. The sound the impact produced was heard by a patrol 3 miles south and would appear in their report as unidentified detonation, source unknown. Kasame's body left the ground. The force carried him backward through the air for 20 feet before he hit the road's surface, and the surface cracked in a radius of 6 feet around the point of landing, and the cracks radiated outward into the tree roots beneath the road, and the trees on either side of the impact groaned from the transmitted force. Samahata hit the ground beside him, still flinching, its scales still retracted, its living surface oriented away from Naruto, the way a compass needle orients away from a magnetic field it was never built to encounter. Kasame lay on the broken road. He was breathing. His eyes were open. His body was transmitting damage reports from a place he had never been hit before. Below the physical, below the chakra network, in the foundation of his spirit, where the thing that made him Kasame lived and operated, and had never, in a lifetime of battles against opponents who should have been able to end him, received a single point of damage. He tried to move his hands. They responded in fragments, fingers twitching, wrists rotating, the connection between intent and execution degraded by something that lived below the nerve pathways. The man who had fought tailed beast hosts, who had gone toe-to-toe with the strongest jonin the shinobi world could produce, who had earned his place among the 7 swordsmen through a career of violence so sustained that his body had adapted to it the way coral adapts to ocean currents. That man was on the ground, in a road, looking at a sky framed by trees, trying to understand what had just happened to him and finding that the understanding required access to a part of himself that the black flash had temporarily disconnected. Itachi had observed the entire exchange. He stood 15 feet behind the position Kasame had occupied before the impact, and his Mangekyo Sharingan had been active since the first second of Kasame's approach, and the Sharingan had recorded everything. The sword's recoil, the speed of Naruto's entry into Kasame's guard, the compression of the spatial distortion, the detonation of the black lightning, the trajectory of Kasame's body through the air. The recording was complete. The analysis was running. The analysis was returning an output that Itachi's genius was absorbing, with the specific stillness of a mind that understands it has encountered something outside its operating model and is restructuring the model in real time. He stood in the road with his hands at his sides and his cloak moving in the breeze, and his Sharingan spinning with the frequency of a dojutsu processing more information per second than it had processed in years. He looked at Naruto. Naruto looked at him. The 12 feet between them held the weight of everything both of them carried. The illness eating Itachi from the inside, the centuries eating Naruto from the inside, the brother who connected them through a chain of grief and love and sacrifice that neither of them had asked for, and both of them had accepted. Soul perception read Itachi Uchiha in full. What Naruto found was the most beautiful ruin he had ever seen in a human soul. The spiritual architecture was collapsing. The illness had reached the foundations. The structural walls were thinning, the entire edifice leaning toward a conclusion that was measured in months. And yet the architecture was still standing. It was still carrying weight. The weight it carried was Sasuke, the mission, the long game, the impossible gamble that the little brother would survive and grow and eventually arrive at the truth and be strong enough when that arrival came to bear it. The entire structure of Itachi Uchiha's remaining life was built around that single objective. And the building was so total, so absolute, that the illness eating the builder was itself subordinated to the schedule, kept at bay by the sheer force of a will that had decided it would die on its own terms and at its own chosen time. Naruto looked at all of it. He looked at it with the eyes of someone who had watched this kind of sacrifice before, the kind that costs everything and tells no one and carries the weight in silence because the silence is part of the cost. He had known people like this. He had loved people like this. He had watched them die. He did something he had never done in a combat encounter in this lifetime or any other. He did not attack. "Your brother carries you like a wound you gave him," Naruto said. "You should have let him see you clearly." The words crossed the 12 feet between them and landed on Itachi with the impact of something that bypassed every defense the prodigy had ever built. The composure, the silence, the persona of the cold missing nin who had killed his clan and walked away without expression. The words went through all of it. They went through it because they were spoken by someone who had seen the truth beneath the persona and was addressing the truth rather than the mask. And the truth was a boy who had loved his brother so much that he had become the monster his brother needed to destroy. And the becoming had been the most painful thing the boy had ever done. And the boy had done it anyway. And the boy was still doing it. The Mangekyou spun. Itachi's expression held. His composure held. But his breathing changed. A shift so subtle that only something with Naruto's perception would have caught it. A half-second hesitation between the inhale and the exhale, the body's involuntary response to hearing something it had been carrying alone for years, spoken aloud by a stranger who understood it completely. Itachi looked at Naruto for a long time. The Sharingan recorded everything about the boy's face, the ancient weight behind the young features, the grief that lived in the eyes like a permanent resident, the particular quality of someone who has been carrying the same kind of weight Itachi carries, and has been carrying it for longer than Itachi's genius can calculate. He turned. He lifted Kasame, the larger man's body draped over his shoulder, with the practiced efficiency of a partner who has performed this gesture before in other contexts, after other fights, and he walked away. He walked back down the road, toward the direction they had come from, and every step he took was the step of a man carrying something that had been adjusted, altered, shifted by a fraction in the direction of a weight he had never allowed himself to put down and had just been told, by someone qualified to say it, that he should have. His soul receded from Naruto's perception range. In the final seconds before it disappeared entirely, Naruto felt the change, a frequency shift, something lighter in the architecture, the spiritual equivalent of a window being opened in a room that had been sealed for a very long time. The air moving through the opening was unfamiliar to the room, and the room was adjusting to it, and the adjustment was fragile and small and uncertain, and it was real. Naruto stood in the road. The cracks from Kasame's impact were still visible in the surface. Samahata lay in the dirt 20 feet away, still retracted, still refusing to extend its scales in the direction the boy was standing. The forest resumed its sounds, birds first, then insects, then the distant movement of animals returning to their normal patterns after the abnormal had passed through. He walked back toward the village. The road ahead was long and straight and held the morning light, the way all roads in Fire Country hold morning light. With the warmth of a land that has known peace and violence in alternating seasons and has absorbed both into the texture of its soil, the intelligence reached the Akatsuki's remaining leadership with the speed of information that carries survival-level urgency. Two of their strongest operatives, one of them their most feared close combat specialist, the other the prodigy who had single-handedly dismantled a clan, had been sent to assess the Nine-Tails Jinchuriki and had returned with Kasame unable to fight and Itachi carrying a changed expression that his handlers could see and could not explain. The assessment was complete. The threat was real. The threat exceeded the model. The response escalated. Pain descended on Konoha on a morning when the sky was clear and the village was awake and the streets were full of people living the kinds of lives that have nothing to do with the violence that is about to interrupt them. The first body arrived above the village on a summons. A massive rhinoceros that materialized in the airspace above the central district and announced the invasion's beginning with the physical fact of its presence, the shadow it cast covering a city block. The remaining 5 paths arrived in formation behind it. 6 bodies, 6 sets of Rinnegan eyes, 1 mind, sitting in a tower outside the village's detection range, operating all 6 through the chakra receivers embedded in their modified flesh. The God Realm body raised its hand, Shinra Tensei. The repulsive force exploded outward from the palm in a sphere that expanded at the speed of moving air and carried the force of something that had decided the ground beneath it was an obstacle. It hit the central district. Buildings cracked, rooftops caved, market stalls disintegrated. The force moved through the physical world with the indifference of something that had been designed to make the physical world irrelevant. And the people inside the force's radius experienced, in the fraction of a second between the technique's deployment and its arrival, the understanding that what was happening to them existed at a scale their lives had never prepared them for. Ambu teams mobilized, Jonin materialized on rooftops. The village's defensive apparatus, the trained response of a military infrastructure that had survived 3 wars and an invasion and had been rebuilt and refined after each, engaged at maximum capacity. Squads formed. Counterattacks launched. The paths moved through the responses with the efficiency of a system operating on a single unified intelligence, each body covering the other's angles, each technique deploying in coordination with every other technique, the 6 bodies functioning as a single organism with 12 arms and 12 eyes, and the full destructive output of the Rinnegan behind every motion. Naruto felt the Shinra Tensei hit the village through his soul perception. He felt it the way a person feels a blow to their own body, immediate, total, the impact registering across the full range of his awareness. He was on the Hokage monument when the first pulse landed, and by the time the second pulse began forming in the God Realm's raised palm, he was already moving. He arrived above the central district in the span between the second Shinra Tensei's formation and its deployment. He was simply there, in the air between the God Realm body and the village below, occupying the space where the repulsive force was about to expand, his body positioned between the technique and the people it was aimed at, flowing red scale, stack activated. His cursed energy surged through every muscle fiber, every tendon, every structure in his body, amplifying every parameter to the ceiling of what centuries of refinement had made possible. The reinforcement was total. The air around him compressed into a visible distortion, a lens of warped light that surrounded his body and made the space he occupied look like a place where the rules were different. Shinra Tensei fired. The repulsive force hit Naruto's reinforcement field and divided. The force scattered, broke around him the way a wave breaks around a pillar that has been standing in the same spot since before the ocean learned its name. The energy routing to either side in streams that dissipated into the air above the rooftops without reaching the buildings below. The God Realm body's Rinnegan tracked the reading, a target whose spiritual density exceeded the technique's ability to register meaningful effect, and the reading produced a brief, visible pause in the body's operation, a fraction of a second, where the unified intelligence behind the 6 paths processed data it had never received and attempted to integrate it into a strategic framework that did not contain a category for what it was seeing. Naruto closed the distance, dismantle. The invisible slash grid expanded from his position and passed through the God Realm body with the totality of a technique that had been resolving targets at this level of durability since before the Rinnegan was a concept anyone could name. The body, a corpse animated by chakra receivers and the will of a mind sitting miles away, came apart along lines so clean that the chakra receivers, still embedded in the separated pieces, continued transmitting signals to the severed fragments for 3 full seconds after the technique completed. The Rinnegan eyes still spinning in a face that was separating from the skull that had held it. The pieces fell toward the village below. They did not reach the buildings. Naruto redirected their trajectory with a pulse of cursed energy that knocked the debris toward the open training grounds to the east, where the fragments landed in the dirt with the sound of something that had been borrowed from death being returned. The Predator Realm moved next. It reached for Naruto's energy with the path's signature ability, the absorption technique. The open palm drain that had made the Preta body the counter to every ninjutsu user who relied on chakra-based offense. The palm extended, the absorption field activated. The field found Naruto's cursed energy and attempted to process it. The field reached into his energy and the mechanism inverted. The same inversion Samahata had experienced, the same fundamental incompatibility between a system designed to absorb chakra and an energy source that operated on a framework the system had never been built to encounter. The absorption field overloaded. The Preta realm body's hands began to crack, fractures running along the palms, the fingers, the wrists, the forearms, the structural integrity of the modified corpse exceeding its tolerance as the energy it was trying to absorb refused to compress into the channels the absorption technique provided. The body broke apart from the inside out, the absorption mechanism consuming its own vessel, and the Preta realm collapsed to the rooftop below in a heap of fractured material that steamed in the morning air. The human realm reached for his soul. The path's ability was soul reading, the technique that allowed the human realm body to extract memories, to read the spiritual architecture of any target it touched, to pull the truth from behind any defense a person could construct. The hand reached for Naruto's head. The fingers made contact with his temple. The reading activated. The human realm body received the input. What it received was everything, centuries of it, lifetimes of it. The full, uncompressed weight of every experience, every death, every loss, every battle, every face, every name, every sunrise and every funeral, and every moment of a soul that had been accumulating experience since before the shinobi system existed. The reading poured into the human realm body's processing capacity and exceeded it immediately. Exceeded it the way the ocean exceeds a cup, the way a lifetime of grief exceeds a single tear, and the body systems locked. The Rinnegan eyes in the human realm's face went wide, then fixed, then stopped processing entirely, and the body stood motionless on the rooftop with its hands still extended toward Naruto's temple and its eyes staring at nothing. Overwhelmed beyond recovery, the spiritual architecture of the path crushed beneath the volume of what it had attempted to read. It toppled. It fell sideways off the rooftop and landed in the street below, and the civilians who had been sheltering behind the building's foundation watched it fall, and watched the boy standing above them on the rooftop from which it had fallen. And the watching was the watching of people who were seeing something they would describe to their grandchildren and never successfully convey. A girl, 9 years old, pressed against the wall of a shelter with her mother's arm across her chest and her face turned toward the crack in the doorway. She saw the sky above the rooftops. She saw the boy moving through it, a shape outlined against the morning blue, wreathed in a distortion that made the air around him shimmer, moving between the remaining paths with the pace of something that was never in danger and knew it, and used the knowing to be thorough rather than hasty. She saw the animal realm summons, enormous beasts pulled from contracts older than the village, each one large enough to shadow entire blocks, appear in the sky above the central district, and fill the air with the sound of things too large to be airborne existing in the airspace regardless. She saw Cleve resolve them. The summons came apart in sequences that took less than a second each, the massive forms dividing along lines invisible to her eyes, the pieces falling in trajectories that Naruto redirected away from the buildings and the people, and the shelters where children like her were pressing their faces against cracks and watching. She watched until her mother pulled her back from the opening, and the last thing she saw before the gap closed was the boy standing on nothing, on air, on force, on the accumulated weight of something she was too young to name and old enough to feel in her chest. The Asura realm arrived with the mechanical augmentations at maximum extension, arms splitting into additional arms, weapons emerging from panels in the torso, the body's design revealing itself as a combat platform optimized for ranged and close quarters engagement simultaneously. It fired. Missiles, bladed limbs, concussive blasts, the full arsenal of a body that had been designed for war by an intelligence that understood war at its mathematical foundation. Black Flash answered. The fist met the Asura realm's central chassis, and the spatial distortion detonated through the mechanical structure with a force that treated the augmentations as irrelevant, passing through armor and weapons and the chakra receivers that held the body together with the same indifference it applied to flesh and bone. The black lightning erupted from the point of contact and branched outward in veins that crossed the sky above the village and cast shadows that moved against the natural light, shadows thrown by energy rather than objects. And every person below who saw those shadows looked up and found the sky rewritten by something they lacked the vocabulary to describe. The Naraka realm attempted to deploy the King of Hell, the regeneration engine, the massive spectral head that emerged from the ground to repair damaged paths and sustain the system's combat viability. The head began to rise from the earth behind the Naraka realm's position, the mouth opening, the scales visible, the technique activating with the ponderous weight of something designed to function as infrastructure rather than a fence. Black flash. The second detonation in 4 seconds. The fist met the Naraka realm body, and the impact traveled through it and into the King of Hell's manifestation simultaneously. The black lightning jumping from the physical impact to the spectral construct through the chakra receiver connection, following the thread, finding the spiritual architecture that held the King of Hell in the material world and severing it with the force of something that treated dimensional anchors the way it treated everything else. The spectral head collapsed. It sank back into the earth, the manifestation unraveling, the mouth closing, the scales dissolving into spiritual residue that dispersed into the ground and left a circular mark on the street surface that would remain visible for months. The sky above Konoha was empty. 6 paths, 6 bodies, all of them resolved in a span of time that the shinobi watching from the rooftops would measure in their reports as less than 90 seconds. The Anbu captain stationed on the administration building's roof lowered her hand from the communication seal she had been activating and let the seal die. The communication had been intended to request backup from the barrier team. The backup was unnecessary. The situation had been resolved before the communication reached its recipient. On the rooftops across the central district, Jonin stood in the postures of people who had been sprinting toward combat and had arrived to find it finished. Might Guy was frozen mid-stride on a rooftop to the north, 1 foot still extended, his body locked in the forward lean of a man who had been running at full speed and had stopped because the thing he was running toward was gone. Kurenai Yuhi stood on the eastern wall, with her hands still forming the first seal of a genjutsu she had been preparing to deploy, her fingers locked in position because releasing them felt like admitting the technique was unnecessary. And the admission was hard to make when everything she understood about combat told her that 6 opponents of this magnitude should have required the full output of Konoha's remaining Jonin force, and had instead required 1 boy. Hiruzen Sarutobi watched from the Hokage Tower. The window was cracked from the first Shinra Tensei's blast pressure. His hands rested on the stone sill, and the stone was cold, and the morning light coming through the cracked glass painted lines across his desk that looked like a map of something broken. He had watched the entire engagement through the scope of the crystal ball technique, and what he had watched was the 90 seconds he would spend the rest of his life trying to reconcile with everything he had believed about the limits of individual power. He watched the boy land on a rooftop below the empty sky and look in a direction that was away from the village, toward the hills, toward the place where his sole perception was reading something that the village's sensor team had been unable to detect. The source of the 6 bodies, the original mind, the man in the tower who had been operating the paths from a distance and was now sitting in a chair experiencing the severing of 6 connections simultaneously, and the silence that followed the severing. Naruto left the village at a pace that the Anbu team assigned to follow him could track for approximately 30 seconds before the boy exceeded their ability to maintain visual contact, and they were left standing on a rooftop, breathing hard, watching the direction he had gone the way people watch the horizon after a storm has moved past it. He found the tower. It sat in the hills beyond the village's outer detection range, a structure of stone and iron grown from the landscape by the Rinnegan's gravitational manipulation, housing a single room at its summit. The room contained a chair. The chair contained Nagato. Naruto stood in the doorway and looked at the man. The emaciated body in the chair was connected to the world through a network of chakra receivers that pierced the skin and anchored the flesh to the chair's structure, and provided the transmission architecture through which the 6 paths had been operated. The body was diminished, thin to the point of translucency. The skin stretched over bones that carried the memory of a body that had once been strong and had been consumed by its own jutsu over years of overuse. The hair was red. The Rinnegan eyes were enormous in the wasted face. The eyes looked at Naruto, and the Rinnegan read everything it could read, and what it read was enough to make the face behind the eyes, the face of a man who had called himself a god and built a theology around the calling, shift by a fraction, a change in the architecture of the expression, the first external sign of a mind encountering something its theology did not account for. Conan stood beside the chair. Her paper wings were extended behind her in a defensive posture, her body positioned between Naruto and Nagato with the protective instinct of someone who had been guarding this man since childhood and would continue guarding him until the guarding was rendered impossible. She was prepared to fight. Her origami jutsu was already active. Thousands of paper sheets hovering in the air around her, each one capable of becoming a blade or an explosive or a shield at the speed of her thought. Naruto looked at her. His soul perception read her spirit, the loyalty, the love, the grief of a woman who had lost everything except the person in the chair and had built her entire existence around the preservation of what remained. He read the beauty of it and the sadness of it and the way the two were intertwined so thoroughly that removing one would destroy the other. He looked past her, at Nagato. Pain is gravity, Naruto said. It presses down on everything in its range. I have been pressed harder than you know how to press. The words arrived in the tower room and filled it. They filled it the way words fill a space when the person speaking them has earned every syllable through experience so vast that the earning itself is a kind of authority. The authority of someone who has been where the listener claims to have been, and has been there longer, and has been there alone, and has survived the being there without turning the survival into a justification for cruelty toward others. Nagato's Rinnegan focused on Naruto's eyes. The reading it produced was the most complete the dojutsu had ever generated. The full spiritual architecture of the boy standing in the doorway, the centuries of accumulated experience, the layers of grief and loss, and the specific quality of a soul that has been carrying weight of this magnitude since before the Rinnegan was implanted in a boy from the rain, and the boy decided that the pain of the world required a god to administer. The reading showed Nagato what he was looking at. It showed him a soul that had been carrying the exact kind of pain he had built his philosophy around for longer than his philosophy had existed. A soul that had experienced loss at a scale that made Nagato's losses, Yahiko's death, Jiraiya's absence, the war that had destroyed his village and his family, and his faith in the world's capacity for justice, look proportional, look survivable, look like what they were, the grief of a single lifetime, vast within its own context and a single lifetime's fraction of the grief standing in his doorway. He launched his final technique. The Gedo statue, the husk of the 10 tails, the massive spectral form that served as the tailed beast's prison and the Rinnegan's ultimate weapon, manifested behind the tower. Its chains extended toward Naruto. The chains were spiritual instruments, designed to reach the target's soul, to grip the spiritual architecture that held the body together, to extract the Biju from its vessel through the simple, overwhelming application of divine force. The chains reached Naruto's soul. They found a mountain. The chains gripped the outer layer of his spiritual architecture, and the mountain did not move. The chains pulled, and the pulling was the full output of the Gedo statue operating at maximum capacity, and the maximum capacity of a weapon designed to extract tailed beasts from their hosts was being applied to a soul that had been carrying weight at this level for centuries, and had developed, in the carrying, a spiritual density that the chains could grip but could not shift. The chains went taut. The Gedo statue strained behind the tower. The stone of the tower cracked from the transmitted force. And Naruto stood in the doorway, unmoved, the chains pulling against something they were never designed to encounter. He walked forward. The chains snapped. Each one, sequentially, the spiritual material exceeding its tensile strength against a target that was simply walking through the force they were applying. The snapping made sounds that existed at a register below normal hearing, sounds felt in the sternum rather than heard in the ear. And each snap was the sound of one more assumption about what was possible breaking against the reality of what was standing in this room. Soul Strike. He delivered it with his open palm, pressed against the center of Nagato's emaciated chest, over the heart that was still beating despite the body's devastation, over the sternum that was thin enough to feel the individual ribs beneath. The strike crossed the boundary between Nagato's physical form and his spiritual foundation, and detonated at the junction. Nagato felt his own philosophy applied to him. The pain arrived at a level he had spent his life theorizing about and had never personally experienced. The level below flesh, below chakra, below the ego structure that had built itself into a god and called the building enlightenment. The Rinnegan lost its spin. The concentric circles went still. The eyes, those enormous legendary eyes, stared at Naruto from a distance of 6 inches. And what they stared at was the face of someone who had carried the pain Nagato worshipped for longer than Nagato's worship had existed. And the carrying had produced something different from what Nagato's theology predicted. The carrying had produced a cog. A man who turned because turning was the verb he had been given, who did not ask the pain to justify itself, who did not build the pain into a framework that required the world to conform to it. A man who simply carried the pain and kept moving. Nagato's remaining chakra left his body in a cascade. The connection to the Gedo statue severed. The chakra receivers dimmed and went inert. The chair held the weight of a body that was no longer holding itself upright by force of will, and the body settled into the chair's frame, and the red hair fell across the wasted face, and the Rinnegan eyes closed. He died knowing the pain was real. He died knowing the boy who ended him had been at the bottom of the depth. Nagato worshipped longer than Nagato could comprehend. Conan's paper wings folded. The thousands of sheets that had been hovering in defensive formation around her settled to the floor of the tower room like leaves falling from a tree that has decided the season is over. She looked at Nagato's body. She looked at Naruto. Her expression held grief and recognition and the specific quality of someone watching a story end that she had known was going to end this way, but had been unable to accept until the ending arrived. Naruto looked at her. He was in pain, he said. The pain was real. What he built from it was wrong. Conan closed her eyes. A single sheet of paper detached from the floor and folded itself autonomously into the shape of a flower, a gesture performed by reflex, the hands of a woman whose art had been the one constant in a life defined by loss. She placed the paper flower on Nagato's chest. She walked past Naruto through the doorway, out of the tower. She walked into the rain that had begun falling outside, and the rain dissolved the outer layers of her paper wings as she walked, and she let it because the wings were for war and the war was over. The village counted the damage. The first Shinra Tensei had been real. Buildings cracked, structures compromised, people injured. The medics worked through the day and into the night. The casualties were low. They were low because the second Shinra Tensei, the one aimed at the village center, the one that would have flattened the central district and everyone inside it, had hit something it could not move and had scattered into the air above the rooftops and dispersed without reaching the ground. The people who had been living inside the central district were alive because a boy had placed himself between them and the force that was aimed at them and had absorbed the force the way the earth absorbs rain. The shinobi world learned about what happened in Konoha. The information traveled through intelligence networks and border contacts, and the informal relay of shinobi who had been present and could not stop talking about what they had seen. The name Naruto Uzumaki entered the vocabulary of every hidden village on the continent, and the entry was permanent, And the weight the name carried in those vocabularies was the weight of something they were still learning how to measure. Months passed. The village rebuilt again. The structures rose. The people resumed the patterns of their lives with the specific resilience of a population that has been told twice in one generation that the world can end and has watched both times as the ending was interrupted by something living in their midst. Then the mask came off. Toby, the name the Akatsuki's final architect had been operating under, the persona worn over the face of a man who had been directing the organization's movements since its inception, removed the orange spiral mask and revealed the face beneath. Obito Uchiha, Kakashi's teammate, the boy who had been crushed under a boulder and saved by a man named Madara and rebuilt in a cave where the walls were lined with Hashirama Senju's cells, and the air was filled with the philosophy of a dead man who believed the world was a failure that required replacement. The intelligence reached Konoha through the Akatsuki's remaining communication channels, which had been compromised since Nagato's death. Kakashi received the confirmation in a briefing room in the Hokage Tower, sitting at a table across from Hiruzen and two Anbu captains, and the way he received it was the way a man receives a blow he has been bracing for without knowing he was bracing. With a stillness so total that the people in the room could hear the building settle around them and the wind move against the windows, and the specific silence of a man whose entire history has just been rewritten by a single piece of information. Obito was alive. The boy whose death had defined Kakashi's life, whose Sharingan sat behind Kakashi's headband as the most permanent reminder of failure any shinobi had ever carried, was alive, and had been alive for decades, and had spent those decades building toward a plan that would end the world as it existed and replace it with a dream. The infinite Tsukuyomi, a genjutsu cast on the moon, reflected onto the earth, trapping every living person in a personalized illusion of their greatest desire, suspending consciousness in a permanent dream that would, in theory, eliminate suffering by eliminating reality. Obito had the Gedo statue. He had the tailed beasts already extracted from their hosts by the Akatsuki's depleted but sufficient operational capacity. He had the plan and the conviction and the grief. The massive, foundational, load-bearing grief of a boy who had loved Rin Nohara and had watched her die on his teammate's hand, and had decided, in the moment of the watching, that a world where that could happen was a world that deserved to be replaced. The Fourth Shinobi World War began with a mobilization that spanned the continent, 5 great nations, 5 hidden villages. An alliance formed from the shared understanding that the thing they were facing would end every one of them if it succeeded, and the only variable that might prevent its success was their combined output. Naruto met Obito on a plane. The plane was wide enough to absorb what was about to happen to it. Miles of flat earth and sparse grass, in the kind of open sky that has nothing between the ground and the clouds except the things that people bring into the space. The Shinobi Alliance was spread across the plane's perimeter. They had been fighting for hours against the White Zetsu army, against the reanimated shinobi that Kabuto's Edo Tensei had pulled from the grave, against the incremental escalation of a war designed to exhaust them while its architect moved toward the endgame. They were exhausted. They were injured. They were operating on reserves, and the kind of stubbornness that keeps armies upright when every other resource has been spent. Obito stood at the plane's center. The Rinnegan occupied one eye, implanted through the same stolen body mechanics that Orochimaru had used and Obito had refined. The Sharingan occupied the other, the Manjikyo pattern spinning with the frequency of a dojutsu, being pushed by the full emotional weight of its wielder's conviction. The Gedo statue stood behind him, the husk of the Ten Tails, massive, hunched, containing the extracted Biju in its sealed interior. Obito's chakra rods connected him to the statue through a web of spiritual architecture that made his body and the weapon a single system. Naruto walked toward him across the plain. His hands were at his sides. His pace was the pace it always was. The steady, unhurried stride of something that had been walking toward things like this since before walking was a conscious decision and had become, instead, the default state of a soul that measured its existence in the distance covered rather than the destination reached. "You wrapped a dead man's dream around your grief and called it a plan," Naruto said. That was never going to hold. Obito's remaining Sharingan spun. The Kamui activated. His body phased, shifting from solid to intangible in the fraction of a second that the technique required. The space-time ninjutsu, converting his physical form into something that existed between dimensions, untouchable by anything operating in the material world. It was the technique that had made Obito the most frustrating opponent in the shinobi world. It was the ability that had allowed him to walk through attacks, through walls, through every physical defense that any opponent had ever constructed against him. It was his primary asset. It was the thing that made him, in his own assessment, impossible to hit. Cleave passed through the space his solid body had occupied a fraction of a second ago and found air. Dismantle's grid expanded across the plane, and the slashes passed through Obito's intangible form without engaging. The technique unable to find purchase on a target that existed in a dimensional state, the slashes could not reach. The first technique reached empty space. The second reached a ghost. Obito phased back to solid and launched. The Renegade's techniques erupted from his extended hand, Shinra Tensei pushing outward, gravitational manipulation, bending the plane's surface into trenches and hills, the full arsenal of a dojutsu that had been designed to reshape reality, deployed with the conviction of a man who believed he was building a better world and was willing to destroy the current one to prove it. The techniques hit the plane. The plane deformed. Naruto stood on the lip of the deformation and did not fall. The exchange continued. Obito phased. He phased through every technique Naruto deployed at the physical level. The cleave, the dismantle grids, the piercing blood that drilled through the air where his solid body should have been and embedded in the plane's surface instead. Every time the Kamui activated, Obito became unreachable. Every time it released, he struck, and every strike was answered by Naruto with the ease of someone who was waiting for the specific piece of information that would end the exchange. And the waiting was patient, and the patience was the patience of centuries. Soul perception was working. It had been working since the first second. It was reading the Kamui's operating frequency, the specific spiritual signature of the dimensional shift, the interval between activation and release, the duration of the intangibility window, the fraction of a second between the technique's engagement and its full deployment, where Obito's body existed in both dimensions simultaneously. The window was narrow, 1/15 of a second. A gap so small that exploiting it would require a reaction speed that existed below the threshold of anything this world's combat systems had ever demanded. The gap was nowhere near narrow enough. Naruto moved into the window. He moved into the fraction of a second between the Kamui's engagement and its completion. The threshold, the scene, the moment where Obito's body was transitioning from solid to intangible and existed for 1/15 of a second in full contact with the physical world. His fist was already in motion when the window opened. The fist arrived at the moment of maximum contact. Black flash. The spatial distortion compressed at the point of impact. The black lightning erupted from Naruto's fist and traveled through Obito's body at the moment of transition. And the lightning did something it had never done in this lifetime. It followed the Kamui's dimensional thread. The black lightning traveled the pathway that connected Obito's body to the pocket dimension the technique accessed, the spiritual highway between the material world and the space-time fold. And it detonated along that highway with the force of something that existed at the intersection of physical law and something older, something that did not acknowledge dimensional boundaries, because dimensional boundaries were a construction of the world's rules, and Black Flash existed in the space where rules became suggestions. The Kamui fractured. The technique did not fail. Failure implies a mechanism that stops functioning and can be restarted. The Kamui broke. The pocket dimension it accessed, the space-time fold that had been Obito's sanctuary, his escape route, the dimensional architecture that had made him untouchable, collapsed on itself. The dimensional walls caved inward like a room whose supports had been removed simultaneously, and the space that had existed between dimensions ceased to exist, and the pathway that had connected Obito's body to that space sealed shut, with a force that produced a sound felt in the bones of every shinobi on the plane. Obito was solid. He was solid, and he was on his knees, and the black lightning was still branching across his body in veins that crossed the plane's surface and left scorch marks in the earth that would be visible from the air for years. His hands were on the ground. The Sharingan was spinning in one eye, spinning with the frantic speed of a dojutsu, searching for a technique that was gone, reaching for a dimensional fold that was no longer there, the ocular muscle memory of a man who had been phasing through the world for decades and was suddenly, irrevocably, unable to phase. Kakashi felt it from the perimeter. He felt the Kamui's destruction the way a person feels the loss of a limb. Phantom, immediate. The sensation of something that was connected to him through the shared dojutsu, registering the severance of the original technique's architecture. His hand went to his headband by reflex. The Sharingan behind the fabric was active, and it was processing the same reading Obito's was. The dimensional fold, gone. The pathway, sealed. The technique that had defined both of their combat identities for decades, broken by a fist that had found the seam and detonated along it with the force of something that treated dimensions the way it treated everything else, as obstacles that existed until they encountered something that decided they didn't. Obito's remaining techniques fired in sequence. The Rinnegan's gravitational manipulation bent the plane around Naruto. The chakra receivers extended from the Gedo statue toward the boy in a barrage of spiritual projectiles designed to impale and transmit and convert. The tailed beast chakra that Obito could still access through his connection to the statue surged through his body in a final amplification that multiplied his physical output beyond what his frame had been designed to contain. Naruto walked through all of it. He walked through the gravitational field the way he had walked through Shinra Tensei. By existing at a spiritual density, the field could not move. He walked through the chakra receivers by letting them hit him and healing the damage faster than the receivers could inflict it, the RCT producing white steam from every impact point as the tissue sealed around the rods and expelled them in the same motion. He walked through the tailed beast chakra's amplified attacks by absorbing the impacts against his flowing red scale reinforcement and letting the force dissipate into the ground beneath his feet. He walked until he was standing over Obito, the boy on his knees, because that was what soul perception showed him in the final seconds. The boy beneath the mask, beneath the Rinnegan, beneath the decades of grief and manipulation. The boy who had been 12 years old and in love with his teammate and had died under a boulder and had been remade by a dead man's hands into a weapon aimed at the world that had taken Rin from him. Soul Strike. Final, Obito's body hit the ground. The grief that had been the structural foundation of everything he had built went out of him in a wave that Naruto's soul perception read as a release, the spiritual equivalent of a clenched fist opening. The fingers that had been holding the grief in their grip for decades finally relaxing. What remained in the last seconds was the boy, Obito Uchiha, 12 years running through the streets of Konoha, late for everything, in love with his teammate, alive and whole, and reaching toward a future he thought he was going to have. The soul that Naruto's perception read in the final moment was clean. It was the soul before the boulder, before Madara, before the cave and the cells and the philosophy and the mask. The boy returned to himself at the end by the only thing that could reach that far beneath the construction. A strike that went below everything and found the original. He did not survive the strike, but he wins the boy. The distinction mattered. It mattered to Naruto, who stood above the body on the ruined plane and added the name to the list of people he had watched die who should have lived. And the list was very long, and he carried it the way he carried everything. And the carrying was the job, and the job was never finished. The plane was still. The wind moved through the ruined grass. The Gedo statue behind Obito's body stood inert. The connection to its operator severed, the system suspended. The massive form hunched against the sky like a monument to an intention that had been interrupted before it could complete. Kakashi stood at the plane's edge and stared at the space where the Kamui had been. His visible eye carried something that was beyond grief and beyond shock, and beyond any of the emotional categories that a man as practiced at concealing his emotional categories as Kakashi Hatake had ever needed to deploy. He stared at the body of his teammate, the boy he had mourned for 20 years, the boy whose eye he carried behind his headband, and whose death he had incorporated into the architecture of his entire adult personality. Lying on the ground with an expression that was impossibly peaceful, Naruto walked past him. He did not speak. What Kakashi was holding in that moment was his own, and the holding of it was a thing that could only be done alone. And Naruto knew this because he had held things like it himself, and the holding had always been solitary, and the solitude had always been the point. The Shinobi Alliance rested. The White Zetsu forces had crumbled with Obito's fall. The reanimated Shinobi had been released when Kabuto was captured by a separate team, and the battlefield was transitioning from active combat to the specific exhaustion of aftermath. Medics moving through the wounded, squads reporting casualties, the organizational infrastructure of 5 allied nations processing the fact that they were still alive. Then the sky changed. The Gedo statue moved. It moved without an operator. It moved because the thing inside it, the thing that all the extracted tailed beasts had been feeding, the thing that the statue had been containing since Obito sealed the first Biju inside it, had reached critical mass. The statue's mouth opened. The stone shell cracked along its entire surface. Something emerged. The 10 tails. It rose from the husk of the statue like a nightmare emerging from stone. A creature of impossible scale, a body assembled from the combined spiritual mass of 9 tailed beasts compressed into a single form, a thing so large that its shadow covered the entire plain, and the sun above it was blocked from horizon to horizon. The creature had 10 tails that thrashed behind it in patterns that destroyed the landscape through sheer physical displacement. Its body was featureless and enormous, and wrong in the way that things assembled from suffering are wrong. Proportions that belonged to nothing. Surfaces that moved in ways surfaces should not. The visual impression of looking at something that should have remained conceptual and had been made, through force and ambition and centuries of planning, horribly, impossibly real. From the 10 tails emergence, from the spiritual resonance of 9 Biju compressed and combined, something older stirred. Something that had been waiting inside the compression for its moment. Madara Uchiha, the real one, the original. The man who had shaped Obito and designed the infinite Tsukuyomi and been the architect behind the architect. He arrived through the Rin rebirth jutsu, reconstituted from the spiritual plane, restored to a living body, stepping onto the plane with the 6-path sage mode active and the Rinnegan in both eyes, and the weight of a man who had spent his entire existence convinced that he was the most significant thing the world had ever produced. The Shinobi Alliance saw him arrive and understood, with the collective instinct of warriors who have been fighting all day and have just watched the threat escalate beyond everything that came before, that the war was entering its final stage. Madara moved through the Alliance the way a force of nature moves through a landscape. The Limbo clones, 6 invisible bodies existing in the shadow world adjacent to reality, struck from dimensions the Alliance's soldiers could not perceive. The Susanoo formed behind him in a pillar of purple flame that rose to the height of the 10 tails and radiated killing intent so dense it made seasoned jonin stumble. Tengai Shinsei activated, the technique reaching into the sky, into orbit, gripping meteorites and pulling them from their trajectories, dragging them burning through the atmosphere toward the plane below, with the force of a man who had decided the ground beneath him had forfeited its right to exist. The meteors descended, 2 of them, each one the size of a city block, burning white at the edges, the heat of atmospheric entry boiling the air in their path, and producing a sound that the shinobi below heard before they saw the source. A roar that came from the sky itself, the sound of the atmosphere being violated by objects that had been resting in the void, and had been torn from that rest by a will that treated celestial bodies as ammunition. Naruto looked up. He saw the meteors burning through the sky. He saw the Limbo clones moving in the shadow world. 6 of them, each one a copy of Madara's spiritual architecture, each one operating in a dimension that conventional senses could not reach. He saw the Susanoo. He saw the Ten Tails. He saw the infinite Tsukuyomi's activation mechanism beginning to build inside the web of chakra connecting Madara to the beast. The sequence initializing, the technique that would cast the genjutsu on the moon and end the world as a place where consciousness existed independently, starting its countdown. He saw all of it. He assessed it with the speed of someone who had assessed larger threats and resolved them and continued walking. He looked at Madara across the ruined plain. The distance between them was irrelevant. Their eyes met across it, the way eyes meet when the distance is a formality, and the confrontation has already begun. "I have watched gods end," Naruto said. "I have been the reason gods ended. You are just the one standing in front of me now." The Limbo clones struck first. 6 invisible bodies, converging on Naruto's position from 6 angles, attacking from a dimension adjacent to the material world with the combined output of 6 copies of the most powerful Uchiha who had ever lived. Naruto's soul perception tracked all 6. They had souls, fragments of Madara's spiritual architecture, copies operating on partial installations of the original's will. Soul perception read fragments with the same resolution it read wholes. He tracked their positions, their trajectories, their attack vectors, and he deployed dismantle into the shadow world. The invisible slash grids passed through the dimensional membrane. The technique's cursed energy operating outside dimensional constraints, because it had always operated outside dimensional constraints. Because the energy powering it belonged to a framework that predated the dimensional architecture this world's techniques were built on. The grids found the Limbo clones in their own space and resolved them there. 6 clones, 6 grids, 6 resolutions, each one occurring in a fraction of a second. The shadow world registering 6 simultaneous cessations of spiritual activity and then going still. The Susanoo swung. The massive arm, made of purple flame, and the concentrated will of a man who had fought Hashirama Senju to a standstill and had spent his death planning his return, descended toward Naruto's position with the force of something that treated the ground as an afterthought. The arm was the size of a building. The fist at its end was the size of a house. The impact it was designed to deliver would have cratered the plane for a quarter mile in every direction. Cleave adjusted, the technique read the Susanoo's durability, the spectral flame, the Uchiha will sustaining it, the 6-path chakra reinforcing its structure, and adjusted its output to exceed everything it found. The slash passed through the Susanoo's descending arm. The arm separated at the elbow. The fist, still burning, still carrying the full force of its swing, fell away from the arm and hit the plane 200 yards from Naruto's position, and the impact cratered the earth as predicted, and the Susanoo recoiled from the loss with the stagger of something that had never had a limb removed and was processing the experience for the first time. The meteors were still falling. Naruto formed one hand sign. Domain expansion. The world changed. The amber light descended. It fell from the sky the way a curtain falls. Total, absolute, replacing the natural blue with something that vibrated at a frequency felt in the marrow of every living thing within its range. The shrine rose from the earth. The pillars emerged. Bone-white stones streaked with red. Surfaces that existed at an angle to the reality they occupied. Architecture that belonged to a consciousness operating on principles so far removed from human design that looking at them produced a sensation closer to hearing than seeing. The pillars curved in ways that satisfied something instinctive and disturbed something rational. The surfaces hummed. The hum was felt in the teeth and the bones and the space behind the eyes. The domain expanded. It expanded past the plane, past the perimeter, past the hills and the forests and the ruined landscape of a war that had been raging for hours. It expanded for miles. The entire battlefield was inside it. Every person, every body, every breathing thing within the domain's range felt the transition. The moment when the sky they had been fighting under was replaced by a sky that belonged to someone else, a sky that was aware of them and was counting them and was holding them inside a space where one will was absolute. The meteors hit the domain's upper boundary. They stopped. They hung in the amber sky. 2 burning masses of stone and iron, each one the size of a city block, suspended above the domain's ceiling by the simple fact that the domain's rules did not include falling rocks from orbit. The domain's space and the material world space occupied the same territory, but answered to different authorities, and the authority that governed this space had decided that the meteors were irrelevant to the proceedings. They froze. The fire at their edges continued burning, but the burning had nowhere to go, and the light they cast. Orange and white, the color of atmospheric entry, the color of something that had been in the void and was now being held at the threshold of a world it was never going to reach, illuminated the domain from above and mixed with the amber of the shrine's light and produced a quality of illumination that belonged to a category the shinobi below had never seen. On the plain, Alliance soldiers looked up. They looked at the meteors frozen above a shrine that had risen from the earth in seconds, and they looked at each other. And the looking was the looking of people who have run out of language and are using their eyes to confirm that what they are seeing is real, and that someone else is seeing it too. A medic named Shizune, kneeling beside a wounded Chunin, with her hands glowing green from a healing jutsu, felt the domain activate. She felt it in her sternum. The hum, the frequency, the weight of the air changing. She looked up. She saw the shrine. She saw the meteors, motionless, burning against the amber sky. Her healing jutsu flickered. Her hands stopped glowing. The wounded Chunin beneath her hands looked at her face and saw something there that made him turn his head to follow her gaze. And what he saw when he looked up was the last thing he would ever be able to describe accurately, and the inability to describe it would haunt his attempts at the telling for the rest of his life. An Alliance captain from the hidden cloud, standing on a ridge that had been a forward observation position before the war turned the ridge into the edge of a crater, gripped his katana's handle so hard the leather wrapping creaked. He had been a shinobi for 22 years. He had fought in border skirmishes and diplomatic incidents, and one engagement that his village classified as a war. He had seen powerful techniques. He had seen the Raikage move at full speed. He had seen the tailed beasts in photographs and intelligence briefs, and had always believed, in the private theater of his imagination, that he understood what they were. He looked at the domain and understood, with the finality of a man whose imagination has just been shown its own ceiling. That understanding was a word he would need to redefine before he could use it again. Benevolent shrine. The slashes arrived. They arrived everywhere. They arrived in the air and in the ground and in the spaces between the air and the ground and in the dimensional folds where the limbo clones had been and in the spectral architecture of the Susanoo and in the 10 tails, spiritual anatomy, and in the web of chakra connecting Madara to the infinite Tsukuyomi's activation mechanism. Millions of them, invisible, microscopic, each one carrying an output adjusted with a targeting resolution refined across centuries of practice into something that existed below the level of effort and above the level of instinct. A middle ground where the technique and the user were so thoroughly integrated that the distinction between them had ceased to be meaningful. The slashes found their targets with absolute specificity. They severed the Renegade's connection to the 10 tails. Each thread of chakra linking Madara to the beast's spiritual architecture cut in the same instant, the web disassembling from every node simultaneously. They severed the infinite Tsukuyomi's activation sequence. The technique's initialization, collapsing as every component required for its deployment, was stripped from the spiritual architecture that held it. They severed the 6-path Sage Mode's power structure, the enhancement framework that gave Madara access to his highest output, dismantled at the foundation, each support removed in concert with every other support, the edifice coming down in a single coordinated collapse that left Madara standing in the domain wearing a body that was running on reserves that had just been reduced from infinite to finite. The 10 tails lost its anchor. The massive form, miles of nightmare, 10 tails thrashing, a body assembled from 9 compressed biju, shuddered. The spiritual architecture that held the beast together as a single entity began to unravel. The biju chakra separated. 9 distinct signatures, compressed and combined, peeled apart from each other in layers. 1 tail's worth, then 2, then 3. the combined entity losing cohesion as the slashes severed the connections that held the combination in place. The 10 tails diminished in stages, its form shrank, its tail stopped thrashing. The massive body that had been blotting out the sky reduced and reduced and reduced until what remained was spiritual residue, a dispersal of energy so vast that it pushed every person on the battlefield off their feet in a wave of pressure that passed through them and continued past them and dissipated into the air in a shimmer that smelled of ozone and the end of something ancient. Madara stood in the domain and felt it happening. He felt every thread being cut. He felt the six-path sage mode stripped from his architecture, the way a structure feels its columns being removed. The loss was instant, total, and the understanding it produced was the understanding of a man discovering that the floor he had built his entire life on was a surface that something else had been holding up, and the something else had decided to let go. The Susanoo collapsed. The spectral flame extinguished. The purple light that had been illuminating the domain from behind Madara's position went out, and what remained was the man, the original, the founder, the architect, standing inside a shrine that was taking apart his life's work with the indifference of something that had been dismantling plans of this magnitude since before Madara's first war. His Sharingan rid everything until the final second. The Tomoe spun. The Rinnegan's concentric circles turned. Both dojutsu were processing the domain, the shrine, the slashes, the boy at the center of all of it, and the processing was returning a reading that Madara's genius was absorbing with the specific expression of a mind that has encountered its own limit and is observing the limit with the honest interest of someone who has been looking for this limit his entire life and has, at the end, found it. He understood. In the final moment, standing inside the benevolent shrine with his power stripped and his plan dismantled, and the dream of the infinite Tsukuyomi lying in pieces around his feet, Madara Uchiha understood what he was looking at. He understood that the boy in the domain was centuries old, and that the centuries were real. He understood that the grief behind the ancient eyes was real. He understood that the cog kept turning, because that was what cogs did, and the turning was the only answer the cog had ever been given to the question of why. And the answer was sufficient, because it had to be, because the alternative to sufficiency was stopping, and stopping was the one thing the cog could not do. He died understanding. The slashes reached the final layer, the spiritual foundation, the bedrock of Madara Uchiha's existence, and they passed through it with the same indifference they had applied to everything above it. The body on the plane's surface settled to the ground. The Rinnegan went still. The Sharingan's Tomoe stopped spinning. The man who had wanted to replace the world with a dream died with the knowledge that the world contained something his dream could never have replaced. And the knowledge was the last thing he carried, the domain held. From the dispersal of the 10 tails spiritual residue, from the compressed void, where 9 Biju had been bound together into a single entity, something older emerged. Kaguya Otsutsuki, the progenitor, the original source of all chakra in this world, sealed inside the 10 tails architecture since the age before the shinobi system existed, waiting with the patience of something that did not experience time the way the things that sealed it did. She emerged into the domain, a presence that made Madara's feel proportional, a spiritual weight that made the six-path sage mode feel like a derivative of something vastly larger. She was tall. She was pale. Her hair moved in ways that had nothing to do with wind. Her eyes, the Byakugan in 2, the Rinne Sharingan in the 3rd, centered on her forehead, looked at the domain and the shrine and the boy at its center, and the reading those eyes produced was more complete than anything Madara's dojutsu had managed. She was old enough to recognize what age looked like. She recognized it now. She reached through dimensions. Space-time shifts opened across the domain's interior, portals to alternate dimensions, to spaces where the laws of physics wore different shapes, each one a displacement designed to separate the battlefield, to scatter the threat, to isolate the boy in a dimension where her power was absolute. The shifts opened in the air like wounds, each one showing a different landscape on its other side. Ice fields, lava plains, deserts of white sand, dimensions built from her will and governed by her presence. Naruto stepped through them. Each shift she opened, he entered. His soul perception read the operating frequency of each dimensional transition, and the reading was instant, and the navigation was instant. And each time she opened a door, he walked through it and arrived on the other side and was standing in front of her before the door closed behind him. Every dimension she fled to, he followed. Every space she opened between them, he collapsed. The pursuit moved through 6 dimensions in a span of seconds, each transition producing a wrench in the air that the Alliance soldiers still standing on the plane felt in their equilibrium, and each transition ending with the boy standing across from the progenitor in whatever space she had chosen, his hands at his sides, his pace unchanged. Cleave activated inside the final dimension, a space of white light and absolute silence where Kaguya's power was at its fullest. The technique adjusted its output to the spiritual architecture of a divine ancestor. The adjustment was the largest single output Cleave had produced, the reading encompassing the full weight of Kaguya's existence, the chakra she had seeded into the world, the connection between her will and every technique every shinobi had ever used. The output exceeded everything it found. The technique passed through Kaguya from every angle simultaneously. What it severed was the connection, the fundamental thread between the progenitor's will and the chakra she had given the world. The thread that made her the origin. The thread that made her the answer to every chakra technique ever developed. The severing was total. The connection fell away from her spiritual architecture, the way a root falls away from a tree that has decided the soil is no longer its concern. Kaguya's form diminished. The Rinne Sharingan's glow faded. The Byakugan's veins receded. She was still present. She was too old and too fundamental to cease existing through force alone. But the connection that had made her the source was gone. And without the connection, what remained was a being without purchase on the world she had seeded. She was unmoored. She was floating. Naruto sealed her. The technique was his own, built across centuries against targets of this exact type, the sealing architecture constructed from cursed energy, and the understanding of how to bind a soul so large that the binding required a framework capable of encompassing everything the soul had ever touched. The seal closed around Kaguya's diminished form and held. The architecture compressed, the binding tightened. The progenitor's consciousness was enclosed inside a seal that would hold for as long as the cursed energy sustaining it existed. And the cursed energy sustaining it had been accumulating for centuries and would continue accumulating for centuries more. She was gone, sealed beyond return. The domain receded. The shrine withdrew into the ground, pillars descending, surfaces folding inward. The alien architecture unmade the way it had been made, returning to the earth it had risen from and leaving the sky above vacant and blue. The amber light faded. The hum and the bones ceased. The world resumed. The meteors, suspended above the domain's boundary for the duration of its deployment, were released. They had been addressed by dismantle during the domain's operation, the invisible slashes resolving them within the domain's space, converting the city block masses of stone and iron into fine particulate that fell from the sky in a cascade so vast it looked like weather. The grit descended across the battlefield, fine and gray, catching the afternoon sunlight as it fell, covering the ruined plain in a layer of what had been the end of the world and was now dust. The light caught the particles and made them glow, and the glow was the color of something finishing, and the finishing was gentle in the way that only truly enormous things can be gentle when they end. The 10 tails was gone. The infinite Tsukuyomi was dismantled. Madara was dead. Kaguya was sealed. The threats that had driven the war, every one of them, from the first white Zetsu to the final divine ancestor, were resolved. The battlefield was still. The Shinobi Alliance lay across the ruined earth, thousands of them, exhausted, injured, many unable to stand, all of them alive. They looked at the sky. The sky was blue. The sky was the same blue it had been before the war, and before the domain, and before the meteors, and before the shrine. And the sameness of it, the persistence of the blue, the stubbornness of a sky that refused to carry the marks of what had happened beneath it, was the most reassuring thing any of them had ever seen. Naruto stood alone in the center of the ruined field. The grit settled on his shoulders and in his hair. He did not brush it off. The smoke from the Ten Tails dispersal drifted around him in wisps that caught the light and turned translucent and dissolved into the air that was already forgetting it had ever carried them. His hands were at his sides. The blood on them was dry. The wounds were closed. The white steam had long since dissipated. The cursed energy hummed through his body the way it always hummed, constant, permanent, the frequency of a soul that had been running since before this world knew it needed running and would continue running long after this world learned to live without the need. He looked at his hands. Small hands. A boy's hands. The fingers were lean and the knuckles were scraped, and the palms carried the ghost of lightning held and flesh that had opened and closed in the same fraction of a second, so many times that the memory of the sensation had been compressed into a dull, permanent awareness of what his hands could hold and what they could survive holding. He flexed his fingers. The cursed energy responded. The hum adjusted. The air around his hands warped by a fraction and then settled, and the settling was the settling of something that had been active for a very long time and was resuming its resting state without urgency, because the resting state was the same as the active state with the volume turned down. He looked at the sky. The blue, the light, the permanent, indifferent, beautiful blue, that would be here long after the plain was overgrown, and the craters were filled, and the dust of the meteors was washed into rivers and carried to the sea and absorbed into the ocean's floor, where it would sit for millennia and never once remember what it had been. Kakashi found him there. The copy ninja walked through the ruined field with the gait of a man who has survived the longest day of his life and has arrived at the other side of it without a map for what comes next. His flak jacket was torn. His headband was crooked. The Sharingan behind it was inactive. The dojutsu had gone still after the Kamui's destruction. The borrowed eye retreating into a dormancy that felt to Kakashi like the end of a conversation he'd been having with a dead friend for 20 years. He walked through the grit and the rubble and the fading smoke, and his shadow stretched long behind him in the afternoon light. And the shadow looked as tired as the man who cast it. He stopped beside Naruto. He looked at the field. He looked at the sky. He did not say anything about what he had witnessed, and because the vocabulary required for what he had witnessed had been rendered insufficient somewhere between the domain's activation and the meteors turning to dust, and the insufficiency was total, and the acknowledgement of it was the most honest thing he could offer. He stood beside the boy who was older than anyone Kakashi had ever known, the boy who had been carrying the world since before the world knew it was being carried, the boy who was standing in the aftermath of everything and looking at the sky with the expression of someone who had seen this sky before, in other colors, above other battlefields, at the end of other wars that this world would never have names for. Is it over? Kakashi asked. Naruto looked at the sky. The blue. The light. The permanent, indifferent, beautiful blue. The shift is not over. It never is. But the machine is still turning. That is enough. Kakashi stood beside him and did not answer, because the answer was unnecessary, because the words were complete in themselves, because the sentences had been spoken by a man who had earned them across centuries and had arrived at them the way a river arrives at the sea, without decision, without performance, following a pull that did not require a name to be real. The sentences sat in the air between two people who had been carrying things for too long and had found in this moment, in this wrecked and dusted field, a place where the carrying was the only thing either of them knew how to do. And the knowing was, in itself, a kind of home. The field breathed around them. Wind moved through the ruined grass. Somewhere behind them, medics were moving through the Alliance's wounded. Hands glowing green, voices giving instructions, the organized urgency of people whose job it was to keep the living alive. Somewhere further back, a village was waiting. The gates would be open. The streets would be full of people who had heard the war was over and were standing in the sunlight trying to decide what to do with the rest of the day that had been given back to them. Somewhere in the ruins of everything that just ended, the world was doing what the world always did, continuing, adjusting to the new shape of itself, learning to live inside a reality that contained less catastrophe than it did an hour ago, and more strange, permanent, unanswerable questions about the boy who had resolved the catastrophe and was standing in its aftermath with his hands at his sides and his eyes on the sky. The smoke cleared. The grit settled. The sun moved across the blue in the way the sun moves, without opinion, without memory, carrying its light from one horizon to the other, with the indifference of something that has been performing the same motion since before the concept of performance existed, and will continue performing it long after the audience is gone. The cog turns. That is what cogs do. It does not ask why the machine requires turning. It does not ask how long the rotation will continue. It does not ask whether the machine deserves the effort. It turns because the turning is the entire architecture of its purpose, and the purpose does not require understanding to function, and the functioning is the answer to every question the silence has ever asked. The field was very still. The sky was very blue. The man inside the boy looked at both and carried both, and would carry both tomorrow, and the day after that, and the day after that, because carrying was the verb he had been given, and the verb was enough, and the enough was everything. The cog turns. That is enough.
If you're not subscribed yet, fix that shit right now. More unfiltered, god-tier crossovers, broken protagonists, and absolute cinema coming your way. Drop a like if this cog just ruined your favorite verse, and I'll see you in the next one. Keep turning.